Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1481. Absorbing the preternatural flame. There is a condition. You have to take me to the soul-suppressing cliff. Laquisha never thought that she would ever need to exchange conditions with people. It didn't help that the one she was negotiating with was a secondary creature, what they usually called creatures like Zen in the Divine Land. The world that the holy being built was gigantic and had the capacity to produce true gods. However, those who lived in the inner world had to rely on the rules set by the holy being to survive. Anyone who dared to leave the inner world inside the holy being's body would turn into life vitality and dissipate. Lower rank living beings were addressed as secondary creatures. It wasn't a term of degradation but a fact-based description. There were still weaker living beings that existed in the Divine Land who were no match for secondary creatures, but these living beings would not turn into life vitality and dissipate. What kind of place is the soul-suppressing cliff? It sounds pretty important, Zen asked. The Divine Refinement Forbidden Land was understandably something Zen didn't know much of, so Laquisha could only explain it to him patiently. The Divine Refinement Forbidden Land was a place where warriors could practice their skills and hone their strength. Those who came from the Divine Land, as well as the elite warriors of the universes, were all qualified to practice here. All sorts of practice places abounded in the land as well as many teleporting areas. After being sent to the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land, Margaret, Rocher, and the others remained in the teleporting areas since there were more than enough training places for them to cultivate in. As their strength gradually increased, they were given even more freedom to go to other cultivation spots where they could improve themselves. If they got strong enough, they would then be able to enter the 6 great trial places. The Collapsing Mountain Race was a sacred place for body refinement. Aside from that place, there was also the Kaleidoscope Race's Wind Exterminating Valley, the Harmony Race's Mind Refining Tower, and the Skyland Race's Pristine Life Vitality and so on. To enter these places, one would need the highest grade of trial tally. Thousands upon thousands of warriors in the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land worked hard to earn their trial tallies. Since you have the trial tally, why don't you go to the soul-suppressing cliff yourself? Zen asked. The soul-suppressing cliff. It's not a sacred place for trial. It is the core of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land which makes it far superior to the other 6 great sacred places, Laquisha answered. The 6 great sacred places for training were the sites warriors mostly yearned for. It was usually their ultimate goal to be able to set foot on these sites. If a warrior cultivated in the Collapsing Mountain Race, then he could easily open the 8-path platforms and even the Divine Stars. It was the best place for body refiners to cultivate. Zen also thought that these sacred places were indeed good places to train in. Since he decided to become a member of the Collapsing Mountain Race, then he had to make sure his strength was on par with the other members. To someone like Laquisha, who was from the Divine Land, however, the Collapsing Mountain Race was nothing special. What people yearned for the most in the Divine Land was the depths of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land where the soul-suppressing cliff, the equinox sand, sunflower water land lay. In the eyes of the warriors of the Divine Land, that was the core of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. Laquisha's explanation clarified a few things to Zen and he even began to have a rough idea of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land's layout. The 10 godly geniuses were sent to the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land by the celestial position. Their final destinations were no doubt the same as most warriors. They all needed to do their best in order to enter the 6 sacred places. Cultivating successfully within the Collapsing Mountain Race would no doubt raise one's strength to the level of World Lord. If one managed to be on par with the Collapsing Mountain Race leaders, then they could most probably be also on par with a Supreme Lord. So what was this about the soul-suppressing cliff? Just what kind of benefits did it provide? What's inside the soul-suppressing cliff? Zen asked. If whatever was in there benefited him in any way, then he wouldn't mind going. It's a place to reinvent creatures. Laquisha answered with gusto. Zen frowned at her answer. What do you mean by that? If we go there, then you'll understand, she said cheekily. Zen was a bit stumped with her answer but nonetheless nodded. Deal. Tempering his body with Laquisha's flame was an urgent matter for Zen, but they couldn't do it here in the collapsing mountain race where there were so many eyes and ears. The problem was that Zen couldn't even move himself, so there was no way he'd be able to take Laquisha away with him. He thought about it for a while before finally coming up with the decision to make do with the current place. Laquisha couldn't pinpoint the origins of Zen's body refining techniques, as she figured that ordinary people would be even less likely to know. As aboriginals of the divine refinement forbidden land, the members of the collapsing mountain race seemed even less interested in the cultivation methods of the outside world. With his mind made up, Zen quickly mobilized his entire strength. Under the strong gravitational force, the amount of primordial energy in his body had reached astonishing levels. This primordial energy could also be considered as a type of power. A weapon refiner would often have their strength seep into the weapon they were forging as they hammered it into shape. The majority of their power would dissipate after a while, but trace amounts would definitely remain on the weapon. At that moment, Zen wanted to use Laquisha's preternatural flame to start a new round of body refining. With the constant flow of power from the dragon scales, Zen slowly stood up against the immense gravitational force and crawled towards Laquisha. Once he arrived at Laquisha's side, Zen found himself in a bit of a dilemma. Laquisha quickly noticed the conflicted expression on his face and immediately guessed what it was about. "Lie beside me and hold my hand." Okay, Zen had only crawled a distance of less than 5 feet, but he had already exhausted most of his strength. When he turned, he completely drained the last bit of strength within him. He landed heavily beside Laquisha with a plop. At that point, Zen couldn't even move his fingers. He simply lay there and rested until he recovered a bit of his strength. He then slowly moved his arm and grabbed onto Laquisha's cold and tender hand. Zen's hold was firm and Laquisha's heart couldn't help but skip a beat. The calamity-dispelling fragrance had disrupted the nerves of many, stimulating the sense of hunger in them. Another kind of primitive desire was also triggered but was mostly overtaken by hunger. Zen grabbing her hand surfaced that other kind of primitive desire and made her feel flustered. She wanted to withdraw her hand, but she didn't really have the strength to resist the gravitational force. "Are you ready?" she asked. Zen nodded in confirmation. "I'll begin," she declared. The spark of the nameless preternatural flame on her body would always signal the beginning of a nightmare. She never expected that there would be someone who would come along and see this preternatural flame as a source of energy. Sizzle! The blue flame surged forth and spread towards Zen. It quickly engulfed his body in a pinch. "What's going on? What has happened to that kid?" Some of the warriors were attracted by the commotion and had different expressions on their faces. Golden runes started to appear all over Zen's body and greedily absorbed the flame. Laquisha's and Zen's entwined hands served as the bridge that transmitted the flame between them. The blue flame followed the bridge and burned endlessly, then it was continuously absorbed by the golden runes that were spinning. This nameless flame couldn't even be fully controlled by Laquisha after she came of age, so there was no way she would be able to stop it. Her beautiful eyes shone with a faint blue light as the blue flame continued to burn. "Zen, are you okay?" Zen remained motionless during the entire ordeal, so she couldn't help but feel a little worried. "I'm fine," Zen answered. "Can you absorb more?" "Yes." Sizzle! An intense pillar of flame shot out dozens of feet into the sky. This pillar immediately attracted many children of the collapsing mountain race. The members of the collapsing mountain race were extremely powerful, brave, and fearless. They were born fighters, but that did not mean that they were reckless. Otherwise, the collapsing mountain race would not have become one of the 6 sacred places for cultivation with such an extreme environment. The sight made them extremely curious, but none of them were stupid enough to rush in and approach this strange sight. One of the children turned around and ran away, screaming loudly for the leaders of the race. Chapter 1482, Barbecue Zen. The members of the collapsing mountain began working at daybreak and retired at sunset. By now, most of the adult males had gone out hunting while the rest and some of the elders stayed within the village. The collapsing mountain child called over an elder. This elder was tall and bony, a white beard hanging down from his mouth that fell to 10 feet long. He looked like a bamboo pole. Despite his looks, he could walk fast and vigorously amidst the powerful gravitational force. It was virtually impossible to see any signs of aging from him. Although Zen was absorbing the preternatural flames, he was still clear-headed. When he saw the elder walk over, he silently put up his guard. There didn't seem to be any logic in the collapsing mountain race. It didn't seem like a good idea to offend them. When the elder saw the flames, he was left stunned. A trace of fear flashed in his eyes, as though the flames awakened genuine fear in him. When he saw Zen frantically absorbing the flames, a strange expression surfaced in his old eyes. "Oh, My goodness. With that, the elder rushed away. In no time, a large group of collapsing mountain elders appeared. Previously, Zen hadn't noticed there were so many of them, but now, over 50 had already gathered before him. All of them were as tall as bamboo poles and were chattering away about something. Some naughty kids kept their eyes on Zen and figured that the flames on his body weren't as dangerous as they first thought. So they took their sticks and moved in to play with the flames, but they were quickly stopped by the elders. They were talking in their own language, so Zen didn't understand what they wanted to do. As the chatter went on, their voices grew louder and louder. When the collapsing mountain members roared, it was as though the mountains were truly collapsing and the earth was cracking. The spirit transformation realm martial artists that were lying on the ground heard a buzzing sound in their ears. If the elders were to roar at the mountain like this, they would probably cause a landslide. Within the flames, Laquisha and Zen looked at each other puzzlingly as they lay on the ground with their hands holding each other. Neither of them could understand the language of the collapsing mountain race, so they had no clue why the people were bickering. Quote. Just then, the old man taking the lead suddenly brandished a walking stick in his hand. By the dignified expression he wore, one would assume he had a high position in the collapsing mountain race. As he waved his walking stick, all the sounds disappeared in an instant. And then everyone fell silent. Then, he walked over with the aid of his walking stick and asked Zen sternly, "What's your name?" At this moment, Zen's body refining was nearing its end and his desire for the flames had already been satisfied. But Laquisha was still releasing the preternatural flames because she couldn't fully control them yet. But it didn't matter. When Zen heard the old man's words, his heart skipped a beat. From the looks of it, the old man didn't mean him well. Did he do something to offend the elder? "I am Zen Luo," he replied with the truth. Zen Luo, what a good name. Much to Zen's surprise, the man's expression and tone of voice shifted, he suddenly became amiable. Even Laquisha was baffled. Shouldn't the old man have been more interested in her preternatural flames? Why was he only paying attention to Zen? After asking Zen for his name, the old man took his leave, leading the group of elders away. Zen had no clue what they were planning to do. Even after some discussion with Laquisha, they still hadn't come up with an answer. 2 hours later, Laquisha's preternatural flames finally stopped. The flames on Zen's body began to extinguish soon after. When the flames were extinguished, so were Zen's clothes. Laquisha screamed in surprise and shut her eyes tight. Her own clothes were sewn with the priceless water threads from the divine land. They weren't made of any material object, but of a special kind of tangible light that could be used to sew clothes. It was rather popular in the divine land. Such a material was expensive, of course, because the water threads were made by changing part of the laws of light. Anyone who knew of this technique was by no means ordinary. Clothes made from water threads were free from dust and filth, they would be as shiny as new even after several years. Laquisha's preternatural flames used to burn all her clothes to the point of leaving her naked. It was so humiliating for her that her brother spent much time and effort getting her this set of clothes made of water threads. But Zen didn't have such clothes. Every time he was burned by the preternatural flames, his clothes were turned to ashes. The situation left him feeling indecent and extremely embarrassed. After the flames were gone, he would merely change into a new set of clothes. But at the moment, it was difficult for him to move. With a slight movement of his finger, he triggered the space ring and pulled out a blanket to cover himself. As Zen and Laquisha lay there, the awkward atmosphere rendered them speechless. Carefully, Zen retracted his hand. He didn't feel it appropriate to hold on to the girl's hand in this situation. For some reason, there was a slight sense of loss in Laquisha's heart. After the body refining by preternatural flames, Zen's body conveyed a very unique feeling. It was as though the strength of his body had increased by several times with each body refining. It was as if his body was reborn. This time, a strange feeling overcame him, as though all the muscles and bones in his body were under his control. A person's muscles were driven by nerves that gathered in the spine, moving along until they gathered in the brain, and then controlled by the soul. But there were always some tissues in the body without nerves. No matter how refined a body was, it was impossible to control every single muscle. For instance, a heart couldn't be made to move left and right, nor could the stomach be freely stretched. But Zen seemed to be able to do such things. The new abilities made him feel even stranger than he already was, like he was becoming a monster. But because he couldn't move, he couldn't verify his conjecture. He couldn't check how far his body had reached after absorbing the flames, either, so he had to wait for the right opportunity to do so. Fortunately, after his body refining, he felt a great increase in his physical strength, along with his power. With the help of the dragon scales, the time to get up was just around the corner. When night fell, everything just got more difficult. As the calamity-dispelling fragrance permeated the air, the grilled meat of the collapsing mountain members also began emanating a fragrant aroma. Just when Zen was prepared to strain his nerves and face this cruel test, two of the clansmen walked up to him. After muttering to themselves, they pulled Zen up from the ground. "What are you guys doing?" Zen asked in concern. The two didn't answer but continued to lift him up and walk him to the huge square. As he was pulled along, Zen swayed left and right. When his eyes swept across the area, he realized that many of the clansmen were looking at him with a peculiar expression. Zen couldn't help but swallow. As he got closer and closer to the huge bonfires, he could feel his heart resist it. Would the collapsing mountain members dismember and eat his flesh? They ate a variety of creatures, after all sorts of fierce beasts as strong as world lords and all kinds of rare and poisonous bugs. It wouldn't be strange for them to eat him. Just as the thought plagued his mind, the two young men carried him to the front of a bonfire. The flames ignited from the calamity-dispelling wood were fierce. Ordinary flames couldn't cook vicious beasts as strong as world lords. There was still about 100 feet between Zen and the bonfire, but he could already feel the scorching heat. The two young men stopped right in front of the bonfire and threw Zen into it. Are they really going to barbecue me? And that was Zen's last thought as he fell into the flames. Chapter 1483. The Heart of the Sinful Dragon. The calamity-dispelling wood burned with extraordinary flames, but none of it harmed Zen in any way. However, the calamity-dispelling fragrance caused him to feel rather stifled when his entire body fell into the fire. Crack, crack, crack. The dry tree trunks continued to collapse as they burned, burying Zen underneath the glowing charcoals. Many of the collapsing mountain warriors gathered around the bonfire and observed Zen carefully. It was obvious that they were already aware of Zen's resistance to fire and were currently using him for this experiment. 3 minutes later, someone bent down and removed the charcoals that had previously buried Zen. Seeing that the young man was unharmed, they pulled him out and threw him carelessly to the side. HDFKIOUE. DAHFDH. There was a discussion amongst all of them in their own language. After a few collective nods and final sounding words, the collapsing mountain race seemed to have come to a conclusion and dispersed. Zen noticed a few warriors from other races mixed in with the collapsing mountain race. He even saw an ogre. At the same time, the warriors on the square seemed to be divided into different grades. The bonfires were set up based on the distribution of the blood grooves. Warriors of the collapsing mountain race gathered around the bonfire in the center while those from the other races gathered around the ones in the periphery. A few warriors of other races could enter the inner circle, but they were generally stronger and were all world lords. Meanwhile, Zen had been thrown into the bonfire right in the middle of the square. "Sit up," ordered a well-built collapsing mountain warrior. Sitting up on his own was a tad bit difficult for Zen due to the overwhelming gravitational pull. His body had been refined successfully, and his strength and endurance had been greatly enhanced, but it still took him a great deal of effort to do as he was told. After borrowing the power of the dragon scales, Zen managed to pull himself up. He did not dare move the slightest once he was upright since any sort of movement would bring him back down again. The collapsing mountain warrior who ordered him to sit up had thick fur on his chest and wore a golden shoulder guard. On that shoulder guard was an exquisitely carved wolf head. The wolf head had 3 sharp thorns on its head. Zen couldn't figure out what kind of wolf it was. The warrior sat down and faced Zen. Clap, clap. Upon clapping his hands, 2 other warriors brought him a huge plate wherein 2 huge hearts were laid. Each of the hearts was taller than Zen, so there was no doubt that both came from some huge beasts. They had already been roasted, which was evident by their oily and steaming surface. It smelled like cooked meat laced with the pungent scent of blood. Strangely, the hearts still beat ever so slightly. There was a cut in one where faint, green blood oozed out of. What kind of beast's heart was this? Despite being dismembered and roasted, the hearts were still beating. Clang! The collapsing mountain warrior took the plate and slammed it down in front of Zen. Because he was already on the verge of collapsing, the air current from the plate was enough to push Zen backwards. Plop! His head landed heavily on the ground as he fell. Ha ha ha! He heard a burst of laughter come from a distance, most probably from the children. However, their mirth was quickly silenced by the collapsing mountain warrior who hushed them. He then turned back to Zen. "Foreigner, you are the first one to stand despite being only at the Spirit Supreme realm." His words made all laughter and conversation cease. The collapsing mountain warriors had a special constitution that enabled them to bear the abnormal gravitational force and move around the place freely. Almost all of the foreigners who got the top-level trial tallies were already at the spirit transformation realm. It was unlikely for Spirit Supreme Realm warriors to accomplish this feat since there were still those at the Spirit Transformation Realm that hadn't even stood up yet. Zen, however, was an exception. The young man once again gritted his teeth and struggled to get up from the ground. The collapsing mountain warrior on the other side grabbed one of the hearts and threw it towards Zen. "This is the sinful dragon's heart. Eat it," he told Zen. Bam! The burning hot heart smashed towards Zen forcefully. It almost smashed him back to the ground again. However, he had already learned his lesson. Before the heart even had the chance to land, he already tilted his body to fall forward. As the heart plopped itself down, the force pushed his body backwards. Because of the opposing forces, Zen was able to sit upright. A trace of admiration flashed on the collapsing mountain warrior's face when he saw through Zen's strategy. Zen held the heart and buried his head on it. He did not care whether it tasted good or not, he simply opened his mouth wide and began to eat it. The calamity-dispelling fragrance had tormented him for so long, and this was a chance for him to finally satiate his hunger. He wolfed down the heart in an attempt to fill himself up in the shortest time possible. The sinful dragon's heart was quite strange, perhaps even revolting. As Zen ate, he felt the meat continue to pulsate. Each swallow intensified a burning sensation in his stomach that spread throughout his entire body. He could feel himself gradually gain power as he ate. The sinful dragon's heart actually has such an effect. He thought and kept on chewing. After relentlessly eating through the heart, Zen finally managed to create an opening. The collapsing mountain warriors were evidently skilled with the blade since the fresh blood remained inside of the heart cavity, though it had already been cut off from the beast. Green-colored blood spurted out of the heart and Zen drank it all forcefully. This display of such voracious appetite was greatly admired by the collapsing mountain warriors. Their logic was simple: a warrior's potential depended on whether or not he had a good appetite. This wasn't necessarily the case for warriors of the outside world. In fact, once a warrior reached a certain boundary in cultivation, they wouldn't even need to eat at all. Before long, Zen had devoured the sinful dragon's heart completely. "You have a good appetite." The collapsing mountain warrior smiled, grabbing his wineskin and throwing it towards Zen. Zen grabbed the wineskin and bit the cork open before gulping down the wine. The drink felt like small knives that sliced through Zen's stomach. However, Zen's body was extremely sturdy along with his internal organs, so it wasn't that much of a big deal. The collapsing mountain warriors quietly stared at Zen as he emptied out the wineskin. The person across him was actually their new leader, Chapman Lay. These warriors were all addicted to alcohol and they drank wine like water. Foreign warriors who stayed in the divine refinement forbidden land long enough would often exchange good wine for trial tallies with the collapsing mountain warriors. Over the years, the collapsing mountain warriors themselves mastered all sorts of strange methods for winemaking. They used water from the nether cold fountain to make frosty wine, which was like white frost that froze the immediate vicinity. They also used the flame serpent fruit to make flame wine that, once ignited, could burn for 10 years. However, the most precious was the soul-enchanting wine in Chapman Lay's wineskin. According to rumors, the winemaking method for it had been given to him by a person from the divine land as a gift. The brewing process combined the blood of various, powerful beasts. The intensity of this wine was beyond imagination. This was not wine at all, but the most violent poison. If a spirit transformation realm warrior took one sip of this wine, they would have to go all out in refining it. Otherwise, they would end up burning from the inside out. That was just one sip. Even Chapman Lay himself only dared to drink one gulp a day. The wine was extremely strong and it was also made from the blood of various beasts. It was held as an extremely precious item for the collapsing mountain race that even the members rarely got the chance to drink it. So Zen drinking it with such tenacity made Chapman Lay feel a great deal of heartbreak and also a tinge of amazement. Chapter 1484, Growth. The collapsing mountain warriors were famous for being bold and generous. Chapman's heart ached, but he couldn't utter a word. All he could do was watch as Zen emptied his wineskin. After holding it in for a long while, he finally said with a smile, good alcohol capacity." Meanwhile, the other collapsing mountain warriors had expressions that made it clear how they wanted to swallow Zen whole. Now, Zen's pupils were completely red. He could feel countless spikes crazily circulating within his body, stimulating every nerve. Under such stimulation, his body underwent a miraculous transformation. In truth, after one entered the collapsing mountain race, the pressure from the gravitational force was already a form of cultivation. So when a martial artist first refined their body, they would choose to cultivate under the waterfall. When the water washed over them, they'd feel pressure on their body and resist it, strengthening themselves. In other words, after one entered the collapsing mountain race, the cultivation had already begun. The collapsing mountain warriors ate precious birds and strange beasts. Although they weren't converted into pills, they weren't to be underestimated. The sinful dragon's heart was originally very rare. Even ordinary collapsing mountain warriors weren't fortunate enough to get a taste. Now that Zen had eaten it, he gained a great benefit. After the meat and wine were finished, Zen's gaze turned calm. "What do you want me to do?" Zen was no fool. How couldn't he see that ordinary people would never get such treatment? The collapsing mountain warrior must have needed him for something. Otherwise, why would he be treated to meat and wine? According to Zen's judgment, the problem lay in his physical body. It might have even been related to his somehow fire-resistant figure. Otherwise, they wouldn't have thrown him into the bonfire. It was true that Chapman felt sorry for his strong wine, but since Zen had already drunk it, there wasn't anything to do. In fact, seeing how the kid wanted to get straight to the point, he rather admired him. "I want you to get something for me," Chapman said rather bluntly. "Let me guess," Zen smiled faintly. "That something is hidden within some kind of strange fire, a fire so powerful that none of you can reach within it, right?" "Yes, that is so," Chapman didn't bother denying. "But I am not strong enough." And Zen was telling the truth. The person before him was able to face a supreme lord. Although Zen didn't fear any fire, he didn't think what the warrior was entrusting to him was as simple as grabbing something from within the flames. Zen was only at the spirit supreme realm, after all. Zen's response made Chapman chuckle. "Our collapsing mountain race is where the strength source is located. With your talent, there shouldn't be a problem." The collapsing mountain warriors didn't resist outsiders, but it wasn't exactly easy for an ordinary foreign martial artist to earn their care. Most of the warriors there relied solely on their own strength to fight for a piece of cake amongst the collapsing mountain warriors. If they were to spend their all nurturing Zen, they would raise his level quickly. It was in their favor that Zen's potential was already strong, to begin with. Although Zen looked calm, he was bubbling with excitement. Such an opportunity could only be found by accident, not sought. When he saw the chance, he couldn't let go. "In that case, I will do all I can to help the collapsing mountain race," Zen said with a laugh. Deal. With Chapman's personality, he wouldn't have forced Zen to do anything. The collapsing mountain warriors never cared about coercing others, nor would they casually receive favors from someone else. If Zen was willing to help them, they would do anything in their power to return the favor. As soon as his voice fell, Chapman grabbed at the air and pulled out a huge piece of meat from the bonfire. With a diameter of 10 feet, the chunk was thrown right at Zen. It pressed him into the ground, causing a burst of laughter. That night, Zen began devouring the various kinds of meat in a kind of frenzy. Each piece of flesh contained a certain kind of power. These strange beasts were at least comparable to world lords, some even supreme lords. But the collapsing mountain warriors had defeated them all. Devouring the meat of these strange beasts was actually wasteful, in a way. There were quite a few top-tier ingredients in the food, kinds that would drive pill refiners crazy. If the meat was made into pills, the effect would multiply. And the warriors knew about this. But there were abundant beasts in the divine refinement forbidden land and the warriors could hunt them every day. They cared not for such waste. Their ancestors had used this method of training for generations, after all. It was a part of their tradition and a part of what created such a valiant race. That night, Zen had no idea how much food he consumed. After dinner, he was carried back by 2 collapsing mountain warriors. Laquisha and the rest of the warriors on the ground stared at Zen with envy. His strength was clearly lacking. He couldn't even stand up, but he could enjoy such treatment. One could only imagine the loss the rest felt in their hearts, having lain on the ground for several years. After all, Zen had barely been in the collapsing mountain race for 10 days. What they weren't aware of was that it hadn't even been a month since Zen had entered the divine refinement forbidden land. As she looked at Zen in dissatisfaction, Laquisha pouted her thin lips. She didn't really care about the food of the collapsing mountain race, and the strength source wasn't quite enough to move her heart, but the calamity-dispelling fragrance was effective enough on her. She felt hungry, and while Zen had stuffed himself with food, she ate nothing. Meanwhile, Zen was leaning against the wall. At this moment, his body was still burning with pain. When he met Laquisha's displeased gaze, he gave her a faint smile and flicked his finger lightly, rolling a piece of meat towards her side. "I haven't forgotten about you," Zen said with a laugh. As he ate and drank, he discreetly hid some food in his space ring. Such action was against the rules of the collapsing mountain race, but they probably wouldn't pursue the matter. When the warriors around them saw the food, their eyes blazed with fire. If only they could move, they would have crawled up and taken the small piece for themselves. But if they could move freely, they would probably forget about the food momentarily. How am I supposed to eat? LaQuisha stared at Zen pitifully. It was too difficult for her to even move her head, and she wasn't willing to end up like him. Burying her head in her food was too unsightly for her. In the end, the heavy responsibility still fell on Zen. It was too difficult for him to stand up and walk, but he could push himself a little, at the very least. Zen looked helpless as LaQuisha stared at him. He could only crawl over slowly and tear the meat into pieces, feeding them to her bit by bit. After consuming the meat, Zen could feel every part of his body be activated. Along with the collapsing mountain warrior's songs, the primitive power was like a tide, constantly surging within his body. Instead of forcing himself to stand up, he gradually adapted to the gravitational force. The next evening, Zen was once again respectfully invited to the square to continue wolfing down his food. The collapsing mountain warriors didn't have any particularly special cultivation methods. Every day, they would eat large chunks of meat, drink loads of wine, and then use the songs, baptism to unknowingly increase their strength. Some people could encounter a situation in which their strength increased, but their bodies couldn't bear the power. But the toughness of Zen's body was no longer what it used to be. After half a month had passed, Zen could feel his strength rise continuously. Now, he could move slowly along the ground. Still, this wasn't exactly something to be proud of. The children of the collapsing mountain race could run all over the place. Even though he was a godly genius, he could only take feeble steps like a dying old man. If he didn't take the utmost care when he walked, he would lose his balance and fall to the ground. But at this growth rate, it wouldn't be long before Zen could move freely. Just that day, there were a few more people arriving at the collapsing mountain race. All of them were world lords. Zen had even met their leader before. He was none other than Kenan, LaQuisha's follower. They were chased by the formless sky python that day. Thanks to Kenan, who held the python's one head to stop it, they managed to run away. But they had no clue whether or not the two world lords were still alive. When these world lords entered the collapsing mountain race, they didn't seem like normal fighters who couldn't get up from the ground. After all, their cultivation and strength were by no means ordinary, and they were strong enough to resist the gravitational force. Still, they couldn't walk freely as they wanted. Princess Royal, seeing that LaQuisha was safe and sound, Kenan finally felt at ease. During this time, he had searched almost every inch of the surrounding area, afraid that LaQuisha would be swallowed up by the formless sky python. He was excited the moment he saw her. Never did he expect her to actually enter the collapsing mountain race's territory to seek refuge. While Kenan looked agitated, LaQuisha wore an indifferent expression. She had been hoping that he would find the place quickly and take her away as soon as possible. But now, she had no desire to go. Chapter 1485, Refusing Kenan's Food. Since Kenan had found LaQuisha, he would simply take her away. However, LaQuisha refused to leave with him. Kenan soon found out that the crux of the problem came from Zen. It was obvious that the Princess Royal still believed that flower vendor and thought that Zen could take her to the soul-suppressing cliff. "Friend, I'm afraid that I'll have to ask you to go with us this time," Kenan said as he stared indifferently at Zen. Last time, Kenan had gotten too close to death because of the formless sky python. His wishing spell hadn't been unlocked yet, until now. While it was true that the wishing spell could greatly increase his strength in a short period of time, he would have to realize the wish he had made if he used the technique. It also meant that if he couldn't kill the formless sky python, then he'd be unable to use the wishing spell again. Moreover, he would have a flaw if he didn't realize his wish, which could be detrimental to him in the future. Zen had only wanted to protect himself on that day, so he had kidnapped the Princess Royal and fled all the way to the collapsing mountain race. Kenan and the warriors with him naturally didn't know what to think of Zen, but now that they had found the Princess Royal, they would bring him back, too. An authoritative air enveloped Kenan as he spoke to Zen. "Why should I go back with you?" Zen asked with a faint smile. He had just got a firm foothold in the collapsing mountain race. There was no way he'd leave so easily. Besides, Kenan wasn't LaQuisha, who actually had something to ask of him. Thus, he coldly shot back, "I'm afraid it isn't up for you to decide. Daniel, Douglas, take him away." In his opinion, a secondary creature at the Spirit Supreme realm was not qualified to bargain with him. Once Kenan was done speaking, the two martial arts practitioners behind him prepared to take Zen away. But before the two of them could even move, a group of warriors from the collapsing mountain race suddenly appeared behind them. Their bulky bodies looked like small mountains as they surrounded the others, and they certainly did not look friendly. Now that Zen was considered as the collapsing mountain race's distinguished guest and they had something to ask of him, how could they allow him to leave? The collapsing mountain warriors looked quite intimidating, that even though Kennen and the other warriors with him were world lords, they still felt a lot of pressure. Respected heroes of the collapsing mountain race, I am Pascal's subordinate, and on behalf of the master of our clan, I'd like to extend my thanks to you for taking good care of our miss at your place, Kennen said calmly while he cupped his hands. An old man from the collapsing mountain race smiled faintly at him. It seemed that the miss of your Han clan has not yet submitted her trial tally, yet we still let her in. We have already shown our respect to Pascal by that. In return, Kennen gently flipped his arm and two purple jade symbols appeared in his hands. The jade symbols were shaped like small knives and flashed with a mysterious color. The most important things in the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land were the trial tallies. All of the trial tallies were divided into 5 colors: black, purple, red, green, and white. They functioned both as the keys to the small and large sacred places for trial, and as the currency of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. Therefore, they could be circulated and traded. The black trial tallies were ranked first and were the most difficult to obtain in the entire Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. The purple trial tallies were second and were the tickets used to enter the 6 sacred places for trial, so they were considered very valuable. Since Laquisha enjoyed a special status, she had purple trial tallies. Meanwhile, ordinary martial artists and even those who came from the Divine Land would have to exert more effort to obtain a purple trial tally. Just as Kennen had brought out the trial tallies, the old man from the collapsing mountain race raised his hand and stopped him. No need. Pascal had made contributions to our race in the past, so there is no need for these purple trial tallies. However, you cannot take this human kid away, he said. Why? Kennen asked. His lips curved into a slight frown. Because this person is very important to our race, the old man said flatly. At that moment, Kennen looked at Zen in shock. If his memory served him right, this man just came to the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land quite recently. It was known that it wasn't easy for the newcomers in the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land to enter a sacred place for trial such as the collapsing mountain race. Not to mention, Zen was only at the Spirit Supreme realm. It was all thanks to the Princess Royal that he was able to enter this place. Was this man really that important to the collapsing mountain race? Kennen found it truly hard to believe what the old man had said. Although the members of the collapsing mountain race had always been unreasonable, they had one great merit: they never lied. If they said that Zen was important to them, then it must be true. Therefore, Kennen found himself in a difficult situation. The Princess Royal must be brought back, or else Kennen wouldn't be able to bear the wrath of the Holy Emperor. Then again, it would be hard for them to convince the Princess Royal to go with them if they chose not to take Zen away. She was too stubborn. Since she refused to go obediently with them, Kennen had no choice but to use force. Kennen turned his head and met Laquisha's eyes. The Holy Emperor had instructed them that if the Princess Royal became too rebellious, they could forcefully bring her back for her safety. After all, her safety was the first priority. Laquisha was extremely intelligent. She quickly guessed what Kennen was thinking and coldly said, "Kennen, I'll make sure you will result to nothing if you take me away by force. And I mean it. This, Your Highness, please do not make things difficult for me," Kennen said as he cupped his hands. "It's you who are making things difficult for me. Remember, in the end, I am still the master and you are still a servant." Laquisha shot back. She was truly afraid that Kennen would suddenly do something to seal her 6 senses and take her away by force. In that way, she wouldn't be able to resist at all. Hesitation dawned on Kennen and the other world lords behind him at Laquisha's words. As servants, they had relied on the Han clan's power to become what they were today. However, they would encounter this kind of dilemma too many times. When Laquisha saw Kennen's conflicted expression, she smiled slightly and said, "Don't be so conflicted, Kennen. Believe me this time, I'm sure my hunch is right now." In turn, Kennen hesitated for a moment before he took out a few more purple trial tallies. "Since Your Highness wants to mess around like this, we have no other choice," he said with a deep sigh. There would be dire consequences if they went back without the Princess Royal. However, since she was determined to stay and follow Zen, they had to stay and accompany her, too. Thus, they had to waste of a few purple trial tallies. Meanwhile, Zen didn't involve himself in the dispute since it didn't have to do much with him. Laquisha had used the strange powerful flame to help Zen to refine his body, and Zen had agreed to help her in return. He would take her to the soul-suppressing cliff if there was a chance, even though he didn't know where that place was. However, Zen had never forgotten that he had entered the divine refinement forbidden land for cultivation. His main goal was to become stronger. The sky turned an inky black and flames glittered in the darkness. Night fell, and the bonfires were set ablaze again. Once again, Zen headed to the square and heartily filled his stomach up. The cultivation in the collapsing mountain race seemed so simple and casual. The more they ate, the faster their strength would grow. And so, Zen ate food that was thrice his weight almost every day. Such an appetite was surprising for an ordinary martial artist. After all, the stomach had a limited capacity. In the collapsing mountain race, however, it was necessary for warriors to use their own strength to digest as much of the food in their stomachs as possible in a short amount of time. Now, Zen's appetite was shocking compared to that of the martial artists from various races, but it still couldn't compare to that of the collapsing mountain warriors. A child from the collapsing mountain race could devour meat 5 times what Zen could eat, while a full-grown collapsing mountain warrior could devour a meal that was almost the same size as a small mountain. Their terrifying ability to digest food had resulted to their equally terrifying bodies and unimaginable strength. It was also the race's foundation to gain a foothold in this world. On the other hand, Kenan and his group looked at each other in dismay when they saw that Zen was qualified to eat his meals in front of the biggest bonfire in the square. If they remembered correctly, only Pascal had the right to eat here back then, and that was where the leader of the collapsing mountain race ate. From this situation, it could be said that the collapsing mountain race did tell the truth. This Zen seemed to be really important to them. However, Kenan and his group were all focused on Laquisha. They clearly knew that the calamity-dispelling fragrance was extremely tortuous, so they first needed to satisfy the Princess Royal's stomach. However, they thought that although the food contained the meat of strange beasts, it still wasn't qualified to be served to the Princess Royal. Then again, they couldn't find better dishes for her at the moment, so they had to settle for what was available. No, take it away. Get out of here. Never would they expect that Laquisha would flat out refuse the exquisite pieces of meat Kenan and the other warriors with him brought to her. But Your Highness, this calamity-dispelling fragrance can increase your appetite 100 times more than normal. Do you really not want to eat the food? Kenan thought it was quite strange. He didn't believe that Laquisha could resist the hunger under the influence of the calamity-dispelling fragrance. Even he himself couldn't resist it, so let alone the Princess Royal. I will not eat it. You just have to take care of yourselves and leave me alone. Laquisha ordered coldly. Not too far away, the martial artists who lay on the ground began to cry as they heard her words. They had dreamed of having a bite of some food for far too long. How could the woman waste such delicious food? Kenan was confused, but the Princess Royal insisted on not eating. They had no choice but to retreat. They were even more confused at the moment. Could it be that the Princess Royal was really able to withstand the calamity-dispelling fragrance? Not long after, Kenan saw Zen slowly moved over from the bonfire and took out chunks of meat, tore them into pieces, and fed them to the Princess Royal. Only then did Kenan realize why the Princess Royal had refused to take the food brought to her by him and other warriors. When Kenan's eyes landed on the Princess Royal's smiling face, he felt even more conflicted. Chapter 1486, Fortuitous Encounters and Dangers. Taking a great deal of responsibility, Kenan had brought the Princess Royal into the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. Due to the special nature of the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land, even those from the Divine Land would cultivate there. All of the famous sects in the Divine Land had branches built within it. Even some large cities were built by people from the Divine Land. The Han clan was no exception. A city, which was located 300 million miles away from the collapsing mountain race, occupied a teleporting area. It could be considered as one of the biggest cities in the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. However, the Holy Emperor was still worried. That was why he had sent Kenan and the others to ensure the safety of the Princess Royal. The previous encounter with the formless sky python scared the heck out of Kenan. In order to save Laquisha, they had risked everything. Thinking about the price to pay for using the wishing spell, he felt quite terrified. Making a promise meant carrying it out in this life. Failure to do so would not only result in a big loophole in their warrior spirit, but a destruction on their cultivation at a critical moment. Given this high stake, they usually wouldn't use the wishing spell unless they felt irreconcilable hatred for their enemies. But due to unavoidable circumstances, Kenan had to make a promise to the formless sky python. Now he had to keep that promise, or suffer the consequences if he failed. He really didn't have much choice. He was well aware of the risks in the task they were given. If the Princess Royal really died, they would also have their heads chopped off when they returned. Getting reminded of the fear he felt with the formless sky python, Kenan shook his head again. Someday in the future, he would have a chance to fulfill his promise. Until that day, he should try not to worry about it too much. Fortunately, the Princess Royal was unharmed. But now, as they continued, Kenan had again seen some signs of trouble, and even some signs of danger. The Princess Royal seemed to have a favorable impression of the secondary creature. "Daniel, what do you think?" Kenan asked, waiting for a piece of advice. "What do you mean?" Daniel replied back in a puzzled tone, unable to interpret what Kenan was referring to. "You forget it," Kenan exclaimed with a sigh. He knew that his companions were planning on doing nothing about it. They knew very well that the Princess Royal was extremely important to the Holy Emperor, but the problem was the Princess Royal had been engaged. Thinking about it, Kenan decided to persuade the Princess Royal, but before he could, Daniel stopped him. "Kenan, don't worry, what you think won't happen." But, Kenan hesitated, there are some matters that the Princess Royal is unable to decide. That man is just a secondary creature, so I'm sure there is nothing to worry about. There will be people who will deal with him when we get back. You and I, as servants, can just pretend that we know nothing, Daniel said flatly. In the Divine Land, people like Kenan and Daniel were as unremarkable as small shrimps. There were things that they couldn't manage. They spent all day sitting back and protecting the Princess Royal. Meanwhile, Zen's most basic training continued. As foreseen, Zen's strength increased every day. At the beginning, it was difficult for him to walk in the collapsing mountain race, but as time passed by, he felt that the gravitational force was getting weaker, which meant that he was getting stronger. Zen was a living proof that as long as ordinary martial artists picked themselves up in the collapsing mountain race, they would make rapid progress. Moreover, Zen had received the best treatment. In order to help him grow quickly, the collapsing mountain race had given him much better treatment than all other martial artists. Every day at dawn, he would be baptized by all the war songs. At sunset, he would feast on all kinds of powerful fierce beasts. For Zen, this was the most primitive and most effective method of training. In a span of 3 months, Zen had improved a lot that he was finally able to resist the gravitational force and walk freely. If he gritted his teeth and tried harder, he could walk as if on wings. However, it was a pity that the gravitational force in the race was too strong. Although Zen knew that his strength had increased a lot, there was no way to confirm how strong he really was. Other than Zen, the rest of the godly geniuses in the universe were also cultivating diligently in different places of the divine refinement forbidden land. In a city 30 million miles away from the collapsing mountain race, Nathan had defeated his last opponent. Now he had one more red trial tally in his hand. In just a few months, he had already obtained 36 red trial tallies. The city was surrounded by 3 trial grounds, but unless warriors had red trial tallies to use as payment, they would lose the chance to enter. However, to Nathan, trial grounds at such a level were useless. I still lack 64 red trial tallies. My progress should be the fastest, right? I wonder how Zen is doing now. Nathan aimed to accumulate 100 red trial tallies. That way he could exchange them for a purple trial tally. When that time came, he would be able to enter the Wind Exterminating Valley to cultivate. Known as one of the 6 sacred places for trial, he wanted to get into the Wind Exterminating Valley, which was the final destination of his trip to the Divine Refinement Forbidden Land. After putting away the red trial tallies he collected, Nathan once again stepped onto the battle ring, looking around to find his opponents beneath. "Who else wants to challenge me?" he shouted proudly. Meanwhile, in an emerald forest 200 million miles away, the scenery was beautiful and enchanting. The trees and the weeds all looked like carved emeralds as the beams of the light reflected on them. The sound of birds chirping filled the air. However, Rocher was not in the mood to appreciate such scenery. He traveled in the forest as fast as the speed of light, not letting anyone catch him with their bare eyes. Whoosh! Following a flash of a sword gleam, a cyan and gray-colored spirit musk deer fell to the ground, badly hurt. Fluttering, Rocher had drawn the musk deer into his space ring. The musk deer was a very agile beast. Both its skin and body were valuable, worth at least 15 green trial tallies, but its eyes were the most precious. It was said that their eyes would turn into a beautiful deep green color when it fled in panic, a strange reaction coming from fear. The greener the eyes of the musk deer were, the more valuable they became. Therefore, after Rocher discovered a spirit musk deer, he would not kill it initially. Instead, he would allow it to flee, letting it run for its life in a long time before chasing and killing it with a single slash. He knew that this was a cruel method, but he had come to the divine refinement forbidden land for the sake of upgrading himself. In order to obtain a purple trial tally and gain the qualifications to enter the mind refining tower, he had no choice but to do so. I need a bit more trial tallies, but I collect them faster than I expected. Sitting under an emerald tree, he decided to stop for a while and rest. Roar! The loud roaring sound broke the silence all of a sudden, causing Rocher to tremble in fear as he quickly hid himself. The spirit musk deer was not the only inhabitant in this forest. There were many other powerful beasts that Rocher could not fight against. On the other hand, in another city, Margaret was strolling on the street, feeling extremely bored. The divine refinement forbidden land was not a good place to travel alone. The key thing was that Zen was not with her, and she had no confidence to find him. According to the news, the suburbs of the city would become extremely dangerous at night. As the sun had already set, darkness started to fall. Where could Zen be? Margaret murmured. Hey, little girl. The low voice of a man coming from the side startled her. Turning her head, Margaret saw a masked warrior dressed in black. She found him dressed a little strange, but from his appearance, he appeared like a human. Margaret blinked. She had seen a lot of strange-looking creatures recently. What's up? She asked. I come here because I feel a unique aura from your body, the masked martial artist answered, letting out a dry laugh. Margaret glared at him, her face revealing a hint of vigilance. Other than the illusion battlefield, she had never cultivated alone, so she was clueless on dealing with such a situation. However, she was not stupid. She decided not to provoke anyone with unknown origins. Turning to look at another direction, she decided to just let it be. Just as she was about to leave, the masked martial artist had flashed to her front, blocking her path. What do you want? Margaret reproached coldly. She bet this man would not dare to make a move in this city. Partly, that made her feel hopeful. You're quite vigilant. Do you know what this is? 4 sword images slowly appeared on the masked warrior's back. Then, the 4 swords suddenly moved and formed in unique array. Seeing the way the 4 swords were arranged, Margaret was taken aback. Although this was merely the first movement of the sword array, her familiarity was aroused. It's God-slaughtering array. Who are you? All the godly geniuses, including Xenia, Kurt and Lucille, were cultivating in the divine refinement forbidden land, striving to make a breakthrough the soonest time possible. All of them had their own fortuitous encounters and dangers. In the blink of an eye, half a year had passed. Now, Zen had completely adapted to the gravitational force of the collapsing mountain race, as if it didn't exist at all. When my brother entered the collapsing mountain race, he took a year and a half to be able to move freely. Impressed, Laquisha thought it was incredible. Kenan and the rest were equally surprised. They found it hard to believe that a secondary creature like Zen could completely adapt to the gravitational force in just half a year without relying on any external force. Chapter 1487, Strength Increase. For Zen to have improved so quickly, the collapsing mountain race must have devoted all their effort to his training. However, it was the innate strength of Zen's body that made the most difference. He had never tested the strength of his human body during this period of time. However, based on his repeated ascension, it was safe to assume that his physical body had now reached the level of a supreme divine weapon. Usually, when a martial artist joined the collapsing mountain race to train their body, their training consisted of 2 parts. One part was body refining. The other part was strength refining. After all, entering the collapsing mountain race was every warrior's way of gaining strength. Whenever warriors stayed with the race, they experienced a notable strength increase. However, as was true for most things, there was a limit. When a martial artist's strength reached a certain degree, it became stagnant. Due to their body's inability to withstand immense power, this was bound to happen. In the past, when Zen used the Cyan Dragon's strength, he had encountered the same issue and was unable to make full use of his power. Now that Zen was no longer facing the same problem, his improvement was naturally swift. After half a year of living and training with the collapsing mountain race, Zen gained a rough understanding of them. More importantly, he also gained insight into the divine refinement forbidden land's various life forms. In an ordinary universe, a martial artist's greatest dream was to transcend it. By succeeding, they would escape the cycles of the heavens and enter the divine land. However, if they could take on a heavenly destiny and become a supreme lord, they would also feel like their life had meaning. The warriors in all universes would agree that these 2 were the ultimate dreams. It was these 2 dreams that urged them to continue their journey toward the peak of martial arts, no matter how difficult it proved to be. The structure of the universe was very stable. From the lower world to the upper world, From the nature creature to the Supreme Lord, no martial artist was exempt from following the same progression. However, the divine refinement Forbidden Land was different. There were some notable differences between the divine refinement Forbidden Land and a typical universe built by a holy being. First of all, the heavens had no equivalent in the divine refinement Forbidden Land. All sorts of powers were in disarray here. Many would consider it simple and primitive. For instance, for a body refiner, it would be exacting to cultivate a substantial strength in the universe. However, there were at least 13 people stronger than a Supreme Lord in the collapsing mountain race. As for Chapman, his strength was unfathomable. In addition, each person from the collapsing mountain race, including each newborn, was comparable to a world lord. These babies were lucky, as they weren't as affected by gravity as the average world lords from outside were. World lords who entered this place were unable to move freely at first because of the place's powerful gravitational pull. The strength source had this effect on its visitors. It compressed all the treasures in the universe into this enormous cave. Then it imparted these to whoever was inside it, but for a price. Receiving these treasures was not painless. What then was the purpose of the divine refinement Forbidden Land? What were the goals of the collapsing mountain race, the Skyland race, the kaleidoscope race, and the other races? Did they exist merely to help martial artists from other universes, perhaps even from the divine land? The only way to answer these questions was to ask the master of the divine refinement Forbidden Land himself. For sure, he would know the purpose of establishing such a place. But who was this master? So far, there had been no answer. The collapsing mountain race, the Skyland race, the kaleidoscope race, and the harmony race were all seeking to know. From the information that Chapman had leaked, the place that they wanted Zen to enter was called the fire refining lair. The thing that he needed to retrieve was somehow related to the master of the divine refinement Forbidden Land. Today, as usual, Zen sat opposite Chapman. They were enjoying generous servings of meat and gulping down wine. Bam! A big silver plate landed with a clang on the ground in front of Zen. "Eat this," Chapman said plainly. On the silver plate were what looked to be golden pupae. They had roasted them, and so Zen couldn't determine from which insect they were. Remarkably, they had strange divine textures on them, but the textures didn't seem to be engraved. Rather, they seemed to have taken shape when the pupae pupated. Did bugs also know how to seal divine textures on their pupae? Zen could only sigh in amazement at the wonders of nature in the divine refinement Forbidden Land. He had eaten way too many strange things during his stay. Nevertheless, under the influence of the calamity-dispelling fragrance, Zen could hardly be picky. He knew he was going to eat whatever was placed in front of him, even though this one was different. Certainly, there had been dishes that were terrifying to eat. Zen thought back to the nightmare beast's brain and the head of the sulfur ghost, and he swallowed hard. Compared to them, the pupae in front of him looked much better. He grabbed a handful and shoved them into his mouth. Crack! A sweet taste, as if he was chewing peanuts, filled Zen's mouth. The food tasted surprisingly good. "This tastes pretty good," Zen said as he took a swig of the strong wine. Then Zen noticed a sudden change in his surroundings. The entire square grew quiet. All the warriors, the collapsing mountain race's clansmen and those from the other races, stared wordlessly at him. Zen froze. "Why are you all staring at me? These are the pupae of the barbarian bees, a type which lives next to the strength source." "They're beyond precious," Chapman said with a faint smile. Zen was quite surprised, as he quickly understood what Chapman was saying. The race leader's words sounded casual, but the expressions on the collapsing mountain clansmen's faces suggested otherwise. "These barbarian bee pupae are probably not an ordinary treasure, huh?" Zen asked. He realized that he had initially underestimated his importance to the collapsing mountain race. Whatever they had asked him to get for them must be very important to them. More or less. Chapman's expression suddenly turned solemn. "The strength source will be accessible in 3 days. I hope you can give it your all." The strength source. The moment Zen entered the collapsing mountain race, he knew that the strength source was the race's foundation. Adjusting to the strong gravitational pull of the place was only the beginning, as it only allowed him to stand alongside the ordinary clansman. The most important step was to enter the strength source. After having eaten all of the pupae, Zen could feel a stable breath of air going up his throat from his stomach. This breath moved not only within his physical body, it also rushed into his elixir field and his inner world. In the world that they were in, there were divine objects that directly affected a warrior's inner world. The barbarian bee pupae were one of them. In the past 6 months, Zen's inner world had been developing rapidly. After the first island had appeared, a layer of green grass grew and gradually covered its surface. The first set of creatures to be born included voles, lizards, and snakes. These creatures had even formed a rudimentary chain of life, feeding on each other, multiplying. Eventually, the world tree grew tall and stretched out its luxurious branches. On this gigantic world tree, other types of living creatures began thriving. All kinds of insects were being born. Everything seemed to be in order. Zen had been wondering when the first human being would be born in his inner world. Over the next 3 days, he felt as if there was a furnace burning inside his body. His body was experiencing the effect of eating the barbarian bee pupae. 3 days later, the warriors came face to face with what they had been preparing for. Zen, the collapsing mountain clansman, and many other martial artists from the other races stood in front of the mountain up north. This mountain was a shiny white color, making it look like it was cast in silver. Chapman led the group to the foot of the mountain and stopped. This is Sacred Spring Mountain, where our strength source lies. How much strength you can obtain will depend on your fortune and on what you've learned so far. The strength source flowed all year round, but even the collapsing mountain race had only one chance in a year to come and see it. When a martial artist from another race entered the collapsing mountain race to train, it would be safe to assume that their goal was to come along during this journey. The martial artists present were rubbing their hands together, and their eyes shone with greed. Everyone there was well aware just how precious the strength source was. Concentrated here was the strength source of the entire divine refinement forbidden land. This type of thing existed in other universes as well, but they did so quite rarely. A single drop of the strength source could cause a huge controversy, and the conditions for its birth in an area were extremely harsh. In a more ideal inner world, the different sources of strength would be more evenly distributed throughout the universe, making them almost impossible to collect with usual resources. Here in the divine refinement forbidden land, however, these kinds of strength sources were concentrated. Another way to look at it was that the owner of this land had probably never planned to build a complete universe. This explained the existence of a concentrated strength source. Although the owner was a holy being, the strength source was placed at random instead of evenly being distributed. The divine refinement forbidden land had been created this way. In other words, the power contained within this strength source was equal to that of a whole universe. One could only imagine how valuable it was. Chapter 1488, Strange Wind. Generally speaking, the 6 sacred places for trial contained different original powers. For instance, the Kaleidoscope race controlled the original laws, the Harmony race controlled the soul source, and the Skyland race controlled the vitality source. A crack extended all the way down from the bottom of the Sacred Spring Mountain. It turned out that it was the entrance that led to the strength source. The sounds of footsteps receded as Chapman and some of the elders of the collapsing mountain race stopped in front of the entrance. The amount of strength source one could obtain depended on many things such as luck, strength, knowledge, and anything else, really. But with all those factors, one still had to rely on oneself. According to the usual practice, the first to enter were the collapsing mountain warriors, followed by the warriors from the other races. However, this time was an exception. This time, Zen was the first to enter, followed by the collapsing mountain warriors, and finally the martial artists from other races. There was no trace of hesitation on Zen at all. He had unintentionally trespassed the collapsing mountain race's territory and got to be assisted by the race, but this was an incomparably precious opportunity. He knew that if it wasn't for this, he would have been still working hard in the teleporting area. He would also have to pay a hefty price if he wanted to enter any of the 6 great trial places, and time was the one thing he couldn't afford. At that moment, the sacred race had already crossed the sighing wall. The entire universe was in a precarious state, even though it was unclear why their true gods had not appeared. In any case, Zen had to seize every chance to improve himself. The fabric of Zen's clothes fluttered. He already felt the wind that blew from the inside of the huge cave before he even got close to it. However, this gale's speed wasn't considered fast, or at least it was far from the point where it could produce wind blades. Such a gale was only a gentle breeze to martial artists, and posed no threats at all. Yet just as Zen came into contact with the gust of the cold wind, his whole body quickly retreated backwards. The seemingly insignificant gust of cold wind had pushed him hundreds of feet away from the cave's entrance. There is a great power hidden within this wind. When Chapman saw what happened, he couldn't help but say, Zen, the wind and strength source are in a convective flow, which is combined with the weak wind formed by the strength source. You can't fight against it with your strength, but the wind is intermittent. Thank you for reminding me, Zen said and nodded. Zen was polite enough to thank him because even if Chapman hadn't said anything, he would still be able to figure out the crux of the matter. Now, Zen was much more careful the second time he entered. He quietly approached the cave from the other side as his whole body clung to the mountain wall, and tried his best to avoid being blown by the weak wind. Then, he stretched out an arm when he neared the edge of the cave. It was at that moment when Zen didn't feel the wind, nor did he rush in. Instead, he waited patiently at the side. Since he knew that the weak wind was intermittent, he'd have to estimate the wind's interval. Whirl, whoosh, the hairs on Zen's arm swayed slightly at the faint breeze. Then, he immediately felt a strong force which pushed his arm away. Even though Zen had only used one hand to sense the wind, the force sent his body flying in a circle before he slammed heavily against a mountain wall on the side. Fortunately, Zen's physical body was not what it used to be. Otherwise, he would have been seriously injured. Still, Zen was shocked as he crawled up from the ground. Was the power contained within the strength source actually that terrifying to such a degree? Soon enough, Zen no longer dared to use his hand to feel the weak wind. Instead, he lightly pulled down a strip of cloth from his waist and threw it at the cave's entrance. PFF'd. Since the piece of cloth was almost weightless, Zen assumed that it could flow with the wind. Alas, the power contained in the strength source had quickly torn it into shreds. Therefore, Zen tore open a few more strips of cloth and stretched them towards the entrance of the cave to probe. After Zen had used about 10 strips of cloth, he stretched another piece of cloth towards the cave entrance once again. This time, there was no more reaction from the inside. Now is the time. Zen wasted no time as he quickly transformed into a beam of light and entered the cave. Whoosh. He did not know the cave's terrain, but he didn't have the time to observe the surroundings, he just relied on his instincts to rush forward. There were times when Zen slammed into the cave's silver walls, and bounced off to the other side with a dull thud before he continued onward. In a mere blink of an eye, Zen had traveled about 300 feet already. It was then when Zen discovered that the way ahead stretched quite far ahead, but there was a large, dark pit nearby. His subconscious led him into the pit. There was a whistling sound behind Zen the moment he entered. It sounded like a weak wind that blew through several stones in the cave. Phew, that was close. If I didn't hide in this pit, I might have been blown away by this strange wind again. After Zen stopped in the huge pit for a while and confirmed that the weak wind had stopped, Zen continued on his way in a flash. During his travel time, Zen discovered that there were large pits that someone must have dug up on both sides of the long tunnel. These pits were around 10 feet deep, and even the collapsing mountain warriors wouldn't have any problem getting inside them. The collapsing mountain warriors must have dug the pits, so that newcomers would have a temporary place to hide. Zen continued to travel, and whenever the wind came, he simply dipped down and hid in the pits, then came out when the wind stopped. He then proceeded forward in a roundabout manner. This sacred spring mountain didn't look that big, but Zen was surprised to find that the cave was so deep. Perhaps he had already passed the sacred spring mountain and now traveled underground. Hoo, hoo, hoo. An hour later, the wind's howls grew louder. It was the point when Zen didn't even need to probe around to know if the wind had stopped or started. Am I close to the eye of the wind? Zen thought. If he passed through the eye of the wind, then he wouldn't be blown away anymore. However, Zen noticed that he still had a way to go until he reached the eye of the wind. In addition, the intervals between the winds got shorter the closer he got to the eye. However, it would still be hard for him to cross the distance by taking advantage of the wind's intervals with his speed. No matter how difficult it was, Zen would never give up. Yet after some consideration, he wasn't that confident that he could actually do it. Hoo, hoo, hoo. 3 intervals had passed while he waited. Suddenly, Zen's eyes flashed. His body was as light as a feather as he pushed off the ground and flew forward like a flying shuttle. Zen had never set a limit for himself. Even if he couldn't do it, he would still at least give it a shot. His body was a blur as he dashed towards the eye of the wind at an extremely fast speed. He had covered only 2/3 of the distance, when he heard a wind's sharp whistle out of the blue. Hoo, the closer he got to the eye of the wind, the more concentrated the wind was. The strength source contained in the weak wind wasn't really strong in the first place. Yet when the weak wind blew, Zen felt as if a hammer had been smashed into his chest. The strong force immediately pushed him backwards. I failed. His face dimmed, and there was a trace of doubt in his eyes. He knew that his speed wasn't slow. If he couldn't break through the eye of the wind, then what more for the others? He suddenly raised his head at the exact moment the weak wind hit and blew him away. He had done his best, but he still couldn't break into the eye of the wind. The problem was not on him, so he must have overlooked something. Up there, when he raised his head, he saw that there was another cave above him. Apparently, the wind was split into two. One wind blew horizontally in the cave where Zen traveled, and the other wind blew towards the cave that was above him. In other words, Zen's destination wasn't actually the eye of the wind, but the cave above. Once Zen had realized the situation, he stomped his feet on the ground. He took advantage of the wind's force that was smashing on his body, then forcefully knocked himself into the cave above him. Bang! Bong! The force of the wind blew so hard that Zen was like a kite that bumped around the cave. He finally rushed upwards, but the wind's power didn't decrease at all. He didn't know how many times he got hit, but he landed on the ground of the cave he aimed for when the wind stopped. Although his body was a divine weapon, such a violent collision still made him dizzy. Just as Zen stopped and before he could get up from the ground, he was greeted by a stream of rainbow-colored water that gushed out right in front of him. The spring water's beauty was simply indescribable. Moreover, just a glimpse of it made Zen feel that he was full of strength. Chapter 1489, A Pool. As the strength source gushed out, it landed upon a hollow path in the cave where it flowed and seeped into a crack on the wall. So this is the strength source. The strength of the holy being. Strength was originally formless. For example, the strength Zen exerted in lifting a rock would be unseen and intangible, it took no visible shape or form. However, the strength source was in liquid form and it was the source of the divine refinement forbidden land. After a holy being constructed a new world, their soul, perception, strength, and life vitality would fuse into its every corner in the form of a source. The holy being who built this divine refinement forbidden land had thrown his own strength source into this place. This strength source came in the form of this seven-colored spring water that attracted Zen greatly. It wasn't just him. Any living creature that came upon such a wonder would never be able to keep calm. However, Zen had a strong resolve and managed to keep a level head. According to Chapman, it was already considered fortunate for the collapsing mountain warriors to swallow a mouthful of strength source upon entering this place. It wasn't unusual for people to often come back empty-handed after their search. Zen looked at the flowing stream in front of him. He was sure that there was more than a single mouthful there. In fact, there was so much to fill an entire barrel with. What would happen if he devoured so much strength source? Zen wasn't really sure, but Chapman told him that it wasn't really a possibility. He, himself, only managed to drink a little more than 10 mouthfuls of spring water back then. Fortunately, it was enough for him to become the collapsing mountain race's leader. After a split second of hesitation, Zen quickly shook it off and carefully made his way to the rocks. He was about 1,000 feet away from the strength source and he could hear the howling of the wind as he pushed on forwards. As he approached, Zen thought it better to crawl. The wind was strong and he didn't want to be drawn into it now that the strength source was so close. If the wind swept him away, he wouldn't know where he'd land. The seven-colored spring got closer and closer as he crawled. A faint fragrance emanated from the spring. This spring water has a scent. Its fragrance was extremely tempting. Every inch towards it fired up an intense lust in Zen's heart and made him want nothing more than to drink mouthful after mouthful of this seven-colored spring water. The strength source did not really have any flavor but awakened an instinctive thirst among living beings. Of course, Zen wasn't aware of that. Zen could never hope to stop this desire that arose from him. It was his primal instinct itself that told him that he must drink this strength source. 800 feet, 500 feet, 300 feet. He grew more excited the closer he got to the water. However, it was at this time that he realized something amiss in front of him. Just as he thought that he was about to reach the strength source, a bottomless ravine appeared. It was massive and incredibly dark. "I must jump," Zen murmured. It was terribly deep, but it was only about 30 feet wide. That distance was nothing to Zen in normal conditions. However, he had to consider the strong gravitational force here. The wind also did not help his situation and could cost him greatly if he wasn't careful. Zen pondered for a moment and lay at the edge of the ravine. He reached out a hand to see if there was any wind. To his assurance, there didn't seem to be any down there. He was already quite used to the terrifying gravitational force after staying in the collapsing mountain race for quite a while. He was already able to move his body quite freely, but his jumping skills were still severely restricted. It would be impossible for him to fly though, so his only option was to give it his all and leap across the ravine. After planning his trajectory, Zen slowly retreated a few steps and breathed deeply. Charge. The strength source wasn't something that could easily be obtained. Zen understood that he would have to take some risks if he wanted to obtain that delectable spring water. Whoosh. He sped up and launched himself off the edge of the ravine, soaring high into the air. It was only 30 feet. He'd make it so long as there weren't any accidents. However, in the midst of floating, Zen's face immediately darkened. An irresistible force seemed to be pulling him downwards. Suddenly, the leap he had planned so carefully ended and he was plunged deep into the ravine. His world was plunged in darkness as he plummeted below. He tried to fly or resist the pull in whatever way he could, but it was futile. The gravitational force was too strong. As he fell though, the force gradually decreased and seemed to now be coming from all directions. As these forces came into equilibrium, Zen came to a point where his body floated in the air. The gravitational forces all pulled at one another, resulting in his suspended state. At that moment, Zen neither ascended nor descended. He merely swayed in the air, supported by the forces of gravity. His current situation reminded him of the boulders back in the collapsing mountain race. Due to the disorder of power, the boulders had been suspended in the air for thousands of years now, never coming down due to the equilibrium of gravitational forces. The gravitational forces won't let me stay here forever, right? Zen tried to struggle but soon gave up. The gravitational forces bound him too tightly for him to move. He felt as if he was a small bug trapped in a spider web. Tick-tack. The sound of flowing water soon reached Zen's ears and he once again smelled a familiar fragrance. Was there also the strength source here? He blinked slightly and looked down. A faint green light spread out from within his pupils and he immediately saw cracks on the side of the mountain. From these cracks flowed the seven-colored spring water. Water flowed downwards but this strength source was flowing upwards. Many of the things in the divine refinement forbidden land went against common sense, so while this scene in front of him was unnatural, Zen wasn't the least bit surprised. The most important thing now was that this strength source was here, except it was too far for him to reach. There was no way he could drink from it like this. Zen tried whatever method to break through the gravitational force's restraints but to no avail. He was completely stuck there, floating in a void with his goal just past his reach. Zen gritted his teeth and, just as he was about to try another method, he saw the water's flow suddenly change. It now flowed downwards. Is it because the gravitational forces changed? As he thought of this, he suddenly felt the equilibrium of gravitational forces supporting him disappear. He didn't have time to react as his body was once again subject to the gravitational force from above as he was pushed up with incredible speed. Whoosh! As he flew, Zen once again returned to the place he had landed on earlier. From there, he saw the strength source gathered into a small stream not too far away. Unfortunately, he still wasn't in possession of his limbs. Zen was continuously pulled upwards, way past where he landed. Bam! In the end, Zen slammed his back onto the ceiling and tumbled down, falling into a strange cave. A rock protruded in front of him and right below it was a drop of strength source. This drop wasn't hanging underneath the stone, rather, it seemed to be affected by the gravitational force and fell towards the top. It was only blocked by the stone, which was why it sat underneath it. A look of joy appeared on Zen's face when he raised his head to look at the ceiling. A pool of strength source gathered at the top of the cave. Chapter 1490, Bee Nest. At the top of the cave, just about 100 feet away from Zen's head, was the calm pool of the seven-colored spring water. Zen took in his surroundings and decided to make a detour. The fastest way up was to climb up. Unfortunately, the impossibly smooth walls of the cave made this an impossibility. Bam! There was only a muffled sound as Zen's fist made contact with the cave wall. He wanted to smash a foothold, but his current strength was not enough to break through the silver rock. Alas! Zen could only sigh. The pool of strength source was only above him, but it seemed to ignore gravity itself. It didn't flow downwards but went wherever it wanted. The young man frowned in frustration. Was there really no way to get up there? He stood in deep thought for a while before a glimmer of hope flashed in his eyes. He had fallen into the mountain stream just now. The strength source in the mountain stream crevice was also reversed and seemed to change direction as it flowed downwards. The direction of the flow was extremely strange. Could it be that the strength source in this sacred spring mountain was bound to reverse its flow after a set period of time? His face fell on the protruded rock next to him. There was still a drop of strength source left at the bottom of the rock, meaning that the strength source here had indeed been reversed. The strength source should have already been at his feet, but after the reversal, it all rushed to the top of the cave and gathered in a small pool. If there is another reversal, then the strength source in the small pond is set to fall down again. He thought. Based on his observations, his conclusion should be correct. Zen carefully examined the ground beneath his feet. The silver rock was riddled with potholes as if it had been eroded by the water for a long time. Most importantly, there was a drop of source strength left behind, which was his most solid proof. It was only one drop, but it quickly captured Zen's attention. He stretched his hand and touched the drop with his finger. The droplet immediately began to change into magnificent colors, as if the entire rainbow had been compressed into it. It looked more like a beautiful gemstone than a drop of liquid. Zen took this droplet in his hand and turned his palm downward. If he turned his hand around, then the strength source would escape upwards. He wasn't about to let this drop go. Zen immediately flipped his palm and swallowed this drop of strength source in one gulp. A wave of fiery power spread out from his throat as his physical body immediately absorbed the strength source. There were no impurities in the drop of strength source, and Zen didn't have to exert any extra effort to absorb it. This was because the strength source was originally a part of this world. As he absorbed it, the strength source naturally began to fuse with Zen. A chill quickly spread through his body. Despite consuming only a single drop, Zen felt his every muscle activate all at once. This feeling is similar to eating the meat of those beasts. But it's more effective, he exclaimed. Almost all of the beasts that the collapsing mountain warriors killed grew up around the area. They were all attracted by the strength source. The beasts were never able to swallow even a single drop of strength source, but it still very much affected them. The ones who truly benefited from the strength source were the collapsing mountain warriors. It was the primary reason why they were innately strong. Zen could feel his strength rapidly increasing. He had been unable to measure the growth of his strength in the collapsing mountain race's place, but he would love to see how much it increased after he left. A single drop already has such a massive effect. Zen then stared up at the pool above his head. If I devour it all, what would happen? Zen's gaze was fervent as he thought this all through. He couldn't climb up and he couldn't get the strength source down, which were his two biggest problems. Zen released his perception and began to look for tools that might help him within his space ring. His belongings were in disarray owing to the random items he had accumulated over the years. Finally, Zen took out a refined iron rope from his space ring. He had taken this iron rope from an internal elixir realm warrior when he was still in the lower world. This iron rope had the capacity to swing over 100 feet long. The only drawback was that it was only a low-grade fairy weapon. Zen didn't have any other choice though, since there was nothing else useful in his space ring. Zen found a small vessel and tied it to the end of the rope. With this, his preparations were now complete. All he needed to do now was throw this up to the pool and use the vessel to scoop out the strength source. However, just as he was about to throw it, Zen heard a cracking sound as the steel rope broke in two. It seemed that it was unable to withstand the gravitation force of this place. The low-grade fairy weapon was as brittle as porcelain here. Alas, Zen had no other choice but to look through his space ring and try to find another suitable tool. Unfortunately, there was simply nothing. All he could do now was wait for gravity to reverse and for the pool to fall. Waiting around doing nothing was extremely frustrating for him. However, he understood that the rules of the divine refinement Forbidden Land were simply unreasonable sometimes. He just really needed patience and luck. Zen sat there for 2 hours, but the pool showed no signs of falling. 2 hours had been too much and Zen could no longer bear to sit still. He was running out of time. Chapman let him in early so that he could seize the opportunity and obtain more strength source. Any more delay might mean the loss of other opportunities. This sacred spring mountain had many branch paths, each leading to a different kind of opportunity. The amount of strength source varied, but any sort of head start would still help him gain the upper hand. Zen took a long, deep look at the pond above his head. All he could do now was remember the direction of this place. It was only a hunch, but he felt as if the reversal of gravity in this cave was not natural and was actually caused by someone controlling it. After some thought, Zen left and decided to continue exploring the depths of the cave. The strength source of the sacred spring mountain was widely distributed and could be seen everywhere. He was just unlucky since he had been unable to obtain some despite being so close. As he walked, the cave sloped downwards. Zen no longer felt the wind or any chaotic gravitational force. There also didn't seem to be any trace of strength source. After the downward slope, the terrain then became flat and he continued walking for a few thousand feet more. The light grew dimmer and Zen was forced to activate his magic vision. In front of him was a huge round ball. As he got closer, he saw that there were fist-sized objects that were going in and out of the ball. These objects were not too big, but there was a powerful hum caused by the vibrations of their wings. A nest. This is the nest of barbarian bees, he mumbled to himself. Chapman had told him that not only was there strength source in the sacred spring mountain, there was also a considerable amount of beasts. These creatures were nurtured by the strength source, so it was only understandable that their power was terrifying. Barbarian bees were one of the more common strange beasts in the cave. They were only the size of his fist, but they could not be taken lightly. Zen had eaten barbarian bees' pupae before, but he had no plans of provoking them right now. Chapter 1491. The Queen Bee. The path extended all the way to the end, but a bee nest seemed to be blocking it. If Zen wanted to proceed, he'd have to pass by it. Undoubtedly, it was a great risk. If the barbarian bees sensed danger, they'd pose great trouble. While Zen wasn't completely certain about the barbarian bees' power, he at least knew that they weren't to be trifled with. But since he had made it that far, he couldn't just turn back. After making up his mind, Zen took a deep breath and began restraining his aura, slowly moving forward along the corner. His movements and footsteps turned extremely light. As far as Zen was concerned, the bees weren't particularly aggressive creatures, so long as they weren't disturbed. The difference between barbarian bees and honeybees was significant, but their habits seemed to be the same. At the very least, the barbarian bees had built their own hive as their own territory. So long as Zen didn't attack it, he could avoid getting himself into any trouble. As he slowly approached the beehive, he could observe everything more clearly. The fist-sized barbarian bees flew in and out of the countless hexagonal openings on top of the hive. Upon taking a closer look, he noticed that under their stomachs, a ball of fur was growing, stained with a drop of 7-colored spring water. The bees directly collected the 7-colored spring water and consumed it like nectar. It was no wonder that the barbarian bees could fly. Even Zen wasn't currently able to fly. After all, he couldn't break free from the powerful attraction force. The barbarian bees fed on the strength source all year long. While flapping their wings, they could escape the place's attraction force. The closer he got to the hive, the more cautious he became. When he was about 80 feet away from the hive, a bad feeling overcame him, like someone was spying on him. Zen grew alert. Though Zen received the best treatment in the collapsing mountain race, that didn't mean that he was immune to danger. In the place without rules, he wouldn't let down his guard. Stopping in his steps, he looked around. There was nothing around him other than a cave in front leading to the top, but it was empty. After some observation, Zen finally made a discovery. There were 2 cracks in the middle of the giant beehive, a pair of eyes hidden within them. These eyes were made of countless compound eyes, with countless small grids. Zen could see his own reflection in each of the grids. He was being carefully watched by this very pair of eyes. The feeling made Zen's hair stand on end. What was this hive? The 2 eyes were at least 10 times larger than those of an ordinary barbarian bee. It definitely wasn't the usual bee. Could it be the queen of the hive? In every swarm of bees, there was usually a queen bee desperately reproducing. This one demanded 99% of the food as all the worker bees served it. But there was only one kind of food in the sacred spring mountain, the strength source. With the thought of the queen bee having been devouring most of the strength source, Zen's heart started beating rapidly. While he was already prepared to encounter some weird things in this place, the eyes fixed on him still made him shudder. I must restrain my breath. At this moment, Zen wanted to close his eyes and try to stop his emotions from fluctuating. Ideally, he would just turn into a piece of wood and pass through. Just as Zen was about to take another step, he heard a rumbling sound. Boom, boom, boom. The sight was shocking. Zen saw a tall and sturdy figure fall from the top of the cave. He was a collapsing mountain member. He was extremely large and the walls of the cave were smooth. As he slid down from the top, he had tremendous momentum and impact. At this moment, Zen no longer had the time to rein in his breath. Instead, he quickly retreated. Boom! Just as he was pushed back, the burly figure tumbled down and crashed into the mountain wall to Zen's right, making a deafening sound. Fortunately, the collapsing mountain man's skin was tough and fleshy, allowing him to avoid any major injury. Just as the man got up and cursed, he saw Zen. Zen, the collapsing mountain warrior looked at him indifferently and immediately called out Zen's name. But he seemed rather unfriendly. After the members of the collapsing mountain race reached adulthood, they'd undergo a coming-of-age ceremony. This entailed entering the sacred spring mountain to receive the actual test before absorbing the strength source to complete a metamorphosis. The warriors from the other races could only follow behind the collapsing mountain warriors and cultivate. So no matter how outstanding the other warriors were, it was no easy feat for them to surpass the collapsing mountain race. Still, there were exceptions every now and then. Pascal, Laquisha's older brother, had also created miracles without being a collapsing mountain warrior. But this time, the situation was different. The collapsing mountain race had attached great importance to Zen, allowing him to be the first to enter the sacred spring mountain. But Chapman had also instructed the other martial artists of the race to do their best to help Zen if they encountered him. While they only had disdain for Zen, they didn't dare to disobey Chapman's orders. Why did he get such great treatment from the collapsing mountain race? Was it just because he had no fear of fire? The young warriors of the collapsing mountain race were left dissatisfied. It was no surprise the collapsing mountain warrior didn't seem particularly friendly upon bumping into Zen. It wasn't exactly possible for him to help Zen, anyway. If he had the chance, he wanted to fight Zen. But just then, Zen pointed at something behind the warrior. When the young man turned around, he was dumbfounded. He stood still, not daring to move or breathe. Buzz, buzz, buzz. When the man fell from the cave, he caused enough commotion to alert the barbarian bees. They had appeared in large numbers and circled in the air. The beehive of the barbarian bees. It was the first time that the warrior had entered the sacred spring mountain, but compared to Zen, he better understood how terrifying the barbarian bees could be. Once they began circling in the air, it meant one thing, it was a warning. If the two were to come any closer, the bees would attack them. Zen and the man were both frozen for a few minutes like statues. The barbarian bees didn't chase them but continued circling the hive before returning inside orderly. Finally, the area had returned to its tranquility. Humph, you must really be stupid to have taken this path. You're basically courting death. The young warrior glared coldly at Zen. But Zen had no care for the man's attitude. Faintly, he replied, "There's a dead end at the back." A dead end? Even the warrior was surprised. As he fell from the top, he wasn't feeling nervous. The paths of the sacred spring mountain were complicated because of the scour of the strength source. So there wasn't supposed to be any sort of dead end. They were all connected to each other and eventually converged into a single path. But the hive was blocking it. The collapsing mountain warrior wouldn't climb up the cave he fell from and Zen just told him about the dead end on the road behind them. There was only one way left for him to go. But the beehive was a problem. What should we do? The collapsing mountain warrior asked out of the blue. Zen curled his lips in thought. Though the warrior had initially seemed hostile, now, he just looked helpless and upset with the outcome. In Zen's eyes, the warrior's character wasn't exactly pleasant. After staying there for half a year, Zen knew that the collapsing mountain members didn't lie. So long as they had any reason to hate someone, they wouldn't bother hiding their hatred. If they needed help, they would turn to others for help without hesitation. But Zen was used to this way of doing things. He didn't bother with the warrior and only said, "We can only pass through carefully. As long as we don't disturb the bees, we'll be fine." Even after the huge commotion, the bees gave them a warning without attacking, so they didn't seem excessively aggressive. There could be one problem though, the queen bee is in the hive, Zen said. What? There's a queen bee here? The warrior almost roared, but then covered his mouth as his eyes filled with fear. His reaction made Zen curious. Isn't it normal to have a queen bee in the hive? The bees normally relied on the queen to breed and produce descendants. It seemed unlikely that the barbarian bees were an exception to the rule. No, it's not like that. It's definitely abnormal to have a queen bee. The warrior looked terrified as he said it. Seeing the expression on his face, Zen realized that he'd taken the matter too lightly. Chapter 1492, The Bee Stings. Why is it not normal that there's a queen bee? Zen asked, bewildered by what he just heard. The collapsing mountain warrior curled his lips before answering, "Our prophet said that there's only one queen bee and it is located in the farthest depths of the sacred spring mountain. If there is only one queen bee, then why is there one here?" The collapsing mountain warrior looked at the hive and noticed the two large eyes looking out towards them. His lips visibly trembled at the sight. If there is a queen bee here, then the queen bee at the bottom of the mountain must have died. Something grave might have happened. We should leave right now. Zen was not familiar with the sacred spring mountain and there were many secrets that the collapsing mountain race hid from the public. Zen never heard of this supposed prophet before, and the only person he knew that led the race was Chapman. He wasn't really willing to leave. If he left now, then he would most probably have to spend another year in the collapsing mountain race. How do we leave? He asked. The collapsing mountain warrior scratched his head. He had totally forgotten that the only path they could take was the one in front of them. If only they had more strength to resist the gravitational force of this place and fly, then they'd be able to return by the route they came in. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to be that easy given their current strength level. The two of them stood in discussion, trying to think of a strategy in getting out. In the end though, they realized that there really was no other way. The two of them simply gritted teeth and continued forward. Given their current situation, the collapsing mountain warrior no longer held any hostility towards Zen. He even told the young foreigner his name, Tegan, and he had just turned 30 this year. The thing was, the way the collapsing mountain race calculated age was not accurate. Daytime was not something that was fixed in the divine refinement forbidden land. Sometimes, the day lasted as long as dozens of hours, sometimes only 3 or 4 hours. The divine refinement forbidden land's calendar was way different from in the universe Zen came from. Tegan walked in front. Despite his huge bulk, he had an extraordinary talent of controlling his strength. He was able to shrink every muscle in his body to help him move as light as a cat. Zen had once again hid his aura. He stared at the scattered barbarian bees before following Tegan quietly. Buzz buzz buzz. A number of barbarian bees flew around the beehive. The large eyes inside the hive still stared at them, following their every move. The queen bee was the greatest threat out of all the bees, and they had to be careful. If they irritated it, then the entire horde of barbarian bees would attack them with no hesitation. The two reached the beehive soon enough. The eyes still stared at them and continued exerting invisible pressure. Just as they were about to walk past, Tegan suddenly stopped. Zen frowned. Was he perhaps too nervous? Move, he told Tegan, giving him a push. However, there was a sudden crisp sound and the cracks on the beehive's surface grew bigger. As the hive chipped away, the queen's eyes were completely exposed along with a part of its head and body. Its fine hair was like iron nails that were inserted upside down on its body. Huff, Tegan suddenly took in a deep breath. Buzz buzz. The sound startled a few of the barbarian bees, who immediately dashed straight towards Zen and Tegan. They did not run, they did not even dare move a single inch. Sometimes it was better to simply accept one's fate than counterattack. Any sort of defense from their part would only agitate even more barbarian bees until the entire hive swarmed towards them. Buzz buzz buzz. One of the barbarian bees hovered in front of Zen with its huge sting at the ready. At the tip of its sting were 2 pitch-black barbs that made it look like an anchor. It was no doubt going to be painful if they ever got stung by these insects. All the muscles in Zen's body had tensed up. If the bees ever attacked, then all he could do was a swift counterattack before fleeing as fast as he could. Fortunately, the bees merely circled around them before slowly returning to the hive. Oh goodness, nothing happened, Zen murmured. Tegan's nervous face also relaxed. However, just as they were heaving their sighs of relief, they heard rumbling sounds coming from behind them. Someone else had fallen down. The two of them looked at each other. There was no need to talk, they knew exactly what they had to do next. Run. Just as they started to dash away, a loud bang rang out from behind them. They didn't know who had fallen down, but such loud commotion would no doubt alert the barbarian bees. Since they were the nearest, they would also be the ones to suffer the most if they didn't move now. They had to run away or risk suffering intense pain from the bees' stings. Their movements caused a good amount of noise, but it was nothing compared to the rumbling sounds of the warrior who was falling behind them. Buzz 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 buzz. At that moment, a swarm of barbarian bees came out of the hive. What is this? Someone cursed from behind Zen. It seemed that the warrior that had fallen down wasn't from the collapsing mountain race, but Zen didn't really have the time to care who it was. The barbarian bees were divided into 2. One group rushed towards the fallen warrior, while the other group chased Zen and Tegan. The two of them no longer cared if the road in front of them was dangerous or not. All they cared about was getting away from the swarm of bees that were out for their blood. Buzz buzz. Unfortunately, their running was nothing compared to the barbarian bees' flying speed. The group that chased them quickly rushed towards Zen. Whoosh. Just as they came, Zen heard an extremely small swishing sound. He lowered his head instinctively and rolled on the ground. Just as he looked up, he saw a bee sting miss him by mere millimeters and hit the ground in front of him. A strange scene then appeared. The sting looked intimidating, but its power shouldn't be that strong. The poison also didn't scare him. However, the moment the bee's sting shot out, it actually nailed itself to the ground. The entire sacred spring mountain was made up of the impenetrable silver rocks that Zen had failed to even dent. For the bee's sting to easily nail itself into the ground spoke volumes of just how painful it was going to be if the bees ever caught up to them. Crash! The originally solid ground suddenly began to boil like water. The sting was acidic and melted the silver rock completely. What a strong corrosive power! This isn't some ordinary poison. Zen suddenly realized just how serious of a matter it was going to be if he was to be stung. Moreover, there were countless barbarian bees behind them, so there was no way they were just going to be stung once. Realizing the gravity of their situation, the two of them began to run even faster. As they ran, they heard an ear-piercing scream behind them. Zen turned his head to look. The warrior's body was already blurry. No doubt that he must have already gotten stung. It only took a few seconds for his entire body to disintegrate from the corrosive poison and turn into a pool of blood. That wasn't all, Zen also saw dozens of stings headed towards him. His eyes widened in fear. Zen quickly stepped on the cave wall and rolled, barely avoiding the oncoming bees. The stings meant for him quickly lodged themselves into a wall, corroding it instantly. The extremely tough silver rock was as tender as tofu with these bees. If he was a second slower, then Zen would have met the same fate as that warrior earlier. Die! Zen roared in anger. Just as he steadied his footing, he took out his long sword and slashed towards the bees. He didn't know if his sword technique was going to work, but he just couldn't sit still and wait for death. Shoo! The effect of the strike completely exceeded his expectations. Zen's strike effectively cut the barbarian bees in two. It seemed the barbarian bees weren't as strong as he thought. He had been in constant alert of the creatures in the divine refinement forbidden land ever since he was chased by the formless sky python. This led him to greatly overestimate the power of these barbarian bees. Their stinging power was terrifying, but, at the end of the day, they were still bees. This type of creature was characterized by their large quantity, fast speed, great agility, and extreme poison. However, their defensive power was still ordinary. Zen felt overjoyed as he used his sword radiance to instantly kill dozens of the barbarian bees. "Come over and help," he shouted over to Tegan. However, he didn't expect the warrior to simply keep pushing forward. "I haven't practiced any martial art. How am I going to help you?" The only thing the collapsing mountain race could rely on was their terrifying strength, but the use of their power remained extremely primitive. Tegan couldn't really do anything to help Zen in any way. He could only rely on himself. The sword radiance Zen summoned served as a net that caught the oncoming barbarian bees and sliced them in half. Buzz 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 buzz. A large number of bees fell with each strike. The halved bodies of the barbarian bees were all that was left in their wake, and many of the ones that still chased after them had grown quite wary of Zen's sword. Whoosh! A sharp whistle rang out as a ray of black radiance shot straight towards Zen. Just as it was about to hit him, Zen suddenly placed his sword horizontally in front of his chest. The black radiance nailed itself onto Zen's sword. In a blink of an eye, the first-rank divine weapon that had accompanied him for so many years turned into a useless pile of molten metal that he had no choice but to throw away. His face immediately darkened, not because he felt sad about the sword, but because he saw that the beehive had completely ruptured. An enormous black thing floated by the cave wall where a pair of huge, compound eyes glistened. It was the queen bee. The black radiance, aimed at Zen just now, had been shot out by the queen bee. Chapter 1493, Melting Rock Wall. The barbarian bee queen didn't have any wings, and looked more like a large worm than a bee. Its tail was stuck up like a scorpion's, with a cluster of black thorns on its tip. The barbarian bee queen looked bloated and heavy, but its movements were quick. When Zen blocked its black light, its 12 posterior legs moved rapidly and charged towards Zen at a tremendously fast speed. When Zen saw the queen charging forwards, he turned back and ran. Zen looked back at Tegan of Collapsing Mountain Race and saw that he was already 1,000 feet ahead. Zen's lips couldn't help but twitch in a small smile. It seemed that the Collapsing Mountain Race wasn't as fearless as they seemed. However, Tegan couldn't be blamed. His courage was based on his ability of being able to take a gamble. Escaping from the barbarian bee queen was something that anyone with an ounce of sense would have done. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. At that moment, Zen was also intensely focused. Every step his feet made was executed with extreme precision. His movement speed was even faster than Tegan. Tegan was raised in the Collapsing Mountain Race since he was born. He was also one of the most outstanding younger generation members. Zen might even lose to him in a contest of pure strength. However, the Collapsing Mountain Race was accustomed to only using their strength to its maximum. They did not know much about moves, techniques, etc. In this type of ecological environment, they did not need to master all. Different races lived in various environments, so the path of different races varied. As Tegan ran ahead, he occasionally turned his head back to check Zen. When he saw the barbarian bee queen behind Zen, it grimaced as if it ate something bad. Tegan sprinted forward with all his might. In general, the test at Sacred Spring Mountain wasn't too risky, but there was still a certain death rate. Every year, during the coming-of-age ceremony, the Collapsing Mountain Race would lose 3 or 4 people. Some of the other races, warriors, would also die in Sacred Spring Mountain. However, being killed by the barbarian bee queen was even more unlucky. After all, this thing shouldn't have been here in the first place. As Tegan ran, his thoughts went wild, and his distracted mind failed to focus on his next step. He missed. He was stunned for a moment before he rolled downwards again. He was incredibly curious as to why there was such a huge pit here. When Zen saw Tegan's figure disappear suddenly in front of him, he immediately understood that Tegan had fallen down. A spark of hope lit up on Zen's face. If he continued on this straight path, he would be caught by the barbarian bee queen sooner or later and be killed for sure. A passageway that led downwards would be the best thing to happen right now. Whoosh! Along with the sound of the wind that whipped past him, Zen's heart jolted. He suddenly jumped up, launching himself into the air. The faintly discernible beam of black light flashed right past Zen's lower body. It hit the rock wall on the side and immediately corroded a large hole in it. Zen borrowed the momentum from his descent to step into the place where Tegan disappeared. According to Zen's calculations, this must be a pit that led downwards. But as he fell, his expression suddenly changed into one of surprise. He saw Tegan climb up out of the pit. As Zen fell, he directly stepped on him and landed on his shoulder. Just as Tegan was about to speak, he was kicked into the pit by Zen. Zen used Tegan's shoulder as he leapt up and somersaulted into the air. His expression immediately turned sour. The place where Tegan fell was just a huge pit and not a passageway downward. Tegan was stomped back into the pit by Zen, but he quickly crawled back out again. At that moment, he had no desire to blame on Zen. Fleeing for his life was his priority. The two of them continued to run forward. The barbarian bee queen's speed was obviously way faster, and it got closer and closer to them. Eventually, the two of them arrived at the end of the road. Their hearts sank at what they saw. The end of this road did not connect with the other caves. It was a dead end. The barbarian bee queen was still on their heels. They had already retreated to the end of this road. The silver stone wall behind them was extremely sturdy and seemed indestructible. As they looked at the rapidly approaching barbarian bee queen, the two of them became more and more anxious. With their combined strength, they wondered if they had the ability to fight the barbarian bee queen head-on. They didn't seem to have a choice. This barbarian bee queen might be the same as the barbarian bees, and its defensive power is not. As Zen was speaking, he suddenly heard the sound, patter, patter. He looked up and saw that this 10-foot-tall collapsing mountain race warrior was actually bawling. What do we do now, hoo-woo? Zen had originally been extremely nervous, but when he saw that the big guy was actually crying, he couldn't help but roll his eyes. He had planned to cooperate with this fellow just now, but who would have thought that he would break down? Zen had no one to rely on but himself. His gaze swept over and he summoned a long bow into his hand. He drew the string and released the arrow. Clap clap. The sharp arrow accelerated and flew straight towards the barbarian bee queen. However, due to the powerful force of gravity, the arrow's speed was greatly decreased. Before the arrow even reached the barbarian bee queen, its power had already been used up. The barbarian bee queen disgustedly brushed the arrow away with its thin forelegs. The barbarian bee queen was angered, most probably due to Zen's resistance. Perhaps it was aware that the two prey in front still had thoughts of fighting back, so it raised its tail and shot 3 bee stings at them. Dodge. As Zen ducked down, he saw that the strong man beside him was still bawling his eyes out. With a sweep of Zen's leg, the strong man too was thrown to the ground. Pop, pop, pop. 3 sharp stings stuck on the rock wall behind them, and caused it to melt continuously. Zen lay flat on the ground. He took advantage of his momentum and knocked another arrow. He shook the bowstring and let the arrow loose again. It was as ineffective as the one before. Zen knew that if he didn't counterattack, the barbarian bee queen would have pounced on him immediately. Indeed, under Zen's continuous attacks, the barbarian bee queen halted its advance. After it waved away his arrow, the barbarian bee queen raised its tail once again. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Another 3 stings shot forward. Although Tegan was extremely depressed at the moment, he didn't want to die. He and Zen crawled up at the same time and avoided those sharp stings. You want to deplete the stings on the tail of the barbarian bee queen? Tegan seemed to sense a glimmer of hope. The stings on the barbarian bee queen's tail were as plentiful as grass, around 50 to 60 of them. It had already shot a portion of them along the way, and now they seemed to be scarcer. If they could really deplete the stings on the tail of the barbarian bee queen, they might have a chance of survival. However, right after Tegan finished speaking, the barbarian bee queen waved its tail. Long barbarian bee stings grew out from its tail again, and it looked like there were more stings than before. Well, forget it, I didn't say anything. The flicker of hope that had just ignited in Tegan's eyes was immediately quenched once again. Zen also furrowed his brows. He thought of the same thing, but at that moment he suddenly felt a chill behind his back. When he turned around, a strange look appeared on his face. "Look behind us, quick," he reminded Tegan. Tegan looked backward and immediately revealed an ecstatic expression. The stone wall behind them was the end of the path. As the barbarian bee queen had shot 3 stings at the wall, a fist-sized hole had been punched into it. This hole was so deep that one couldn't see the bottom. A cool breeze blew through it. So this rock wall is actually very thin. Tegan's face was filled with surprise as he smashed his fist against another part of the wall, hoping that he could use his brute force to break it. However, this silver rock was too hard for their fists. Even if it was just a thin layer of rock, it wasn't something they could break. Maybe Chapman could break through it. Zen shook his head and could do nothing but sigh at the fellow's stupidity. He quietly knocked an arrow onto the longbow again. "Prepare to dodge," Zen said as he released the bowstring. He hadn't expected the arrow to kill the barbarian bee queen. He was now luring it to continue shooting its stings so the rock wall would be opened behind them. That would give them a chance to escape. Although Tegan's brain was not working at the moment, the barbarian bee queen was even worse. It was its instinct to immediately retaliate after it received an attack. The barbarian bee queen was unwittingly extremely cooperative. As Zen's arrow shot out, it also shot out 3 beams of black light. Chapter 1494. A 7-colored river. There was still a certain distance between the barbarian bee queen and Zen. But if the barbarian bee queen took a step forward, it would be extremely difficult for Zen and his companion to avoid it. Pop, pop, pop. With this bubbling sound, 3 barbarian bee stings once again shot towards the rock wall behind the 2 of them. At first, it sounded like the silvery rock was being boiled, like hot water. However, it slowly changed and began to flow smoothly. One could only imagine the strong and corrosive power that was enclosed within these barbarian bee stings. The hole was already the size of a fist. As it continued to corrode, the hole became bigger and bigger. Within a matter of seconds, a hole that was huge enough to fit a human head appeared. And that was exactly what they wanted. "You can go now," Zen murmured. Usually, if the hole was big enough to fit one's head, then the body could get in just fine. However, the stout guy who stood next to Zen seemed to have a problem. Just by glancing at it, he was skeptical if he could enter. And Zen, looking at him, realized the doubt that was going on in his mind. Tegan's face turned red when he became aware of this fact. Moreover, he began to tremble as well, wondering what would happen to him. There was a part of him that worried Zen would leave him alone to face the barbarian bee queen. But that didn't happen. In the end, Zen decided he wouldn't enter alone. Instead, he continued to lure the barbarian bee queen to shoot out the stings. The barbarian bee queen shook its tail to send out the barbarian bee stings and crawled towards the 2 of them. Tactfully, the 2 of them moved around the small hole, hoping to lure the barbarian bee queen to shoot stings onto the part around the small hole. Under the dire situation, this was their only hope. They secretly prayed that the luck would be on their side. After all, they couldn't control the barbarian bee queen's aim. Sometimes, when the barbarian bee stings were too accurate, they would directly drill into the small hole. However, as the stings kept shooting over, more and more rocks behind them started to melt. In the end, a large hole was created, just like they wanted. However, before they could relish their success, the barbarian bee queen began to increase its speed. The barbarian bee stings on its tail were now shooting extremely fast. This made it hard for the 2 of them to dodge them. With his huge body, Tegan, especially, had a tough time defending himself. The barbarian bee stings came very close to getting him. Realizing it wasn't safe to stay out any longer, the 2 of them quickly entered the big hole. Since the stings drifting into the cave didn't make any sound, the 2 of them knew with certainty that the back of the cave was empty. The moment they entered the cave, the 2 of them began to descend rapidly. Once they were in, Zen could even see the 2 stings flying above their heads. "That barbarian bee queen wouldn't chase us, right?" Zen turned his head to take a look, only to see that the barbarian bee queen had stuck out a pair of huge eyes from the hole and retracted them in the end. Under such high-intensity gravity, if they were to fall too far, even Zen was likely to break into a million pieces. "No, we can't land on that incomparably hard silver-colored rock," Zen thought. After collecting his thoughts, he twisted his body and observed the distance below him. However, just as he glanced down, Zen caught sight of a bunch of black dots flying below him. Although he did not know what they were, his instinct told him he had to avoid them. Unfortunately, Zen was unable to fly in the air and had no way to dodge them. In the end, he and Tegan both stumbled into the black dots and passed through them. Then, they realized those black dots were fingertip-sized bugs. This was a pitch-black area, and they couldn't see the bottom. Fortunately, they did not hurt themselves after falling. The two of them landed on a slope and continued to descend. The strength of the descent was increasing, but the slope became slower. As a consequence, the speed at which the two of them were falling decelerated. After rolling to the bottom, they stood up and composed themselves. All of a sudden, Tegan seemed disturbed. He jumped up from the ground and started inspecting his body. What? A strange expression appeared on Zen's face. These are mosquito larvae. We are so unlucky. We just ran into mosquito larvae. Tegan shouted. Mosquito larvae, what will happen? Zen asked, not knowing what was there to be afraid of. He noticed that the fear on Tegan's face had intensified. Even while meeting the barbarian bee queen, he didn't seem this anxious. This thing will lay an egg on a warrior's skin, and then it will hatch inside one's body. Tegan elaborated. Hearing this, Zen's eyebrows creased. He raised his arm and noticed small black spots on his own body. To him, they looked harmless. It was beyond him how these tiny eggs, similar to sesame seeds, could harm them. They were the eggs of the mosquito larva. These eggs were drilled deep into his skin. No matter what, it wasn't a pleasant feeling to be wrapped in mosquito larvae. These little bugs can't be strong. They seem very weak. How can they enter my body? Zen wondered, ludicrously. Zen, however, couldn't help but become suspicious of his partner's words. He suddenly circulated his chaotic energy and was about to force these small black dots out. Unexpectedly, his trick didn't make things better. Instead, it became worse. With this power, the little black dots began to drill deeper. Zen was shocked and quickly dispersed his chaotic energy. What should we do? Zen asked, out of options. Even though Tegan did not possess a bright mind, he was still a man from Collapsing Mountain race. Since he had quickly recognized these mosquito larvae, Zen assumed everyone in the Collapsing Mountain race knew how to deal with them. The only way to get rid of them is use poison, Tegan explained. These types of larvae were not rare in the Sacred Spring Mountain, and they even existed in areas beyond the Collapsing Mountain race. After being bitten by these worms, eggs would get attached to the victim's body. This was indeed very troublesome. In the beginning, the Collapsing Mountain race had no method to deal with it. Patiently, they would wait for the small larvae to hatch and then pick them out with a knife. However, this method was in no way a safe route. Even if one managed to live through it, they would lose at least half their lives by doing it. Realizing there had to be a different way to get out of this misery, the Collapsing Mountain race ventured to find out another method. That was when they discovered that these larvae were afraid of a specific poison. If one consumed that poison, the mosquito larva eggs would be completely destroyed beneath the skin. Unfortunately, this was a risky method. The poison that would be required was quite toxic and extremely strong. From the belt on his waist, Tegan dug out a small purple bottle. This is rattan poison. It can drive away these larva eggs. After he finished speaking, he opened the small bottle and took a sip. He then glanced at Zen. This fellow had saved his life. Now that he no longer held much hostility towards Zen, he continued, this rattan poison is very strong. Ordinary warriors' bodies wouldn't be able to withstand it at all. I don't dare to drink too much, so I can only restrain these little bugs. How much you can manage to drink depends on your strength. If he was an adult of the Collapsing Mountain race, he would have been able to drink the poison in one gulp and force the larva eggs out of his body. But Tegan was too young and just at the start of his adult life. Although Collapsing Mountain race was much stronger than ordinary warriors, Tegan dared not to take all of the rattan poison. After drinking a little bit, he could only suppress the eggs. He would think of something else when he returned to the Collapsing Mountain race. From his point of view, as a human, Zen wouldn't be able to bear the burden of this poison. He believed a sip was enough to take his life. Seeing Tegan's worried expression, Zen smiled and directly took the bottle from him. This bottle had looked extremely small in the hand of the Collapsing Mountain race man, but in Zen's hand, it was like a wine pot. He accepted the pot of poison and gulped it down. Perhaps Zen's strength was not outstanding at the moment, nor was it exceptional in the divine refinement Forbidden Land. However, there was something about Zen that Tegan didn't know. He wasn't afraid of poisons. You will die. Seeing Zen drink so much in one gulp, Tegan's mouth was wide open. Actually, these larvae won't kill you. You could just pick them out with a knife. Zen wiped the corner of his mouth and passed the small bottle to Tegan, smiling faintly. This is very little poison. I will be fine. As he stopped speaking, the poison started to spread continuously through Zen's meridians. The larva eggs that had infiltrated Zen's skin seemed to feel an indescribable fear towards him as they continued to leave his skin. In a matter of seconds, most of the larva eggs fell to the ground like rice grains after they crawled out. That rattan poison was the nemesis of these larva eggs. Taking just a bit of poison, they would die. All this while, Tegan had been staring at Zen in utter shock. He found it hard to believe in Zen's words. However, seeing he had faced no difficulty after consuming the poison, Tegan realized it was indeed true. It seemed that nothing bad would happen to him. Therefore, he understood that besides not being afraid of flames, Zen was also immune to all poisons. Isn't that amazing? He thought with awe. Soon, they cleaned up and got rid of the larva eggs. After this, they both began to survey the environment. After he lifted his head, Zen's eyes suddenly lit up. He could already see a bit of seven-colored spring water hidden within the strange rocks on the mountain wall. There was actually quite a lot of strength source there. With its constant reversal and flowing characteristics, the strength source hadn't fallen into the upper regions of the ceiling must have been because it was wrapped by these rugged and strange stones. Suddenly, a thought occurred in his mind. Zen subconsciously looked up and his entire body froze. Tegan had sensed that something was off with Zen. Similarly, he followed Zen's gaze and lifted his head to look above. His burly figure immediately trembled. Above their heads, there was actually a seven-colored river that was undoubtedly formed from strength source. They watched it flow, as if it was a dream watercolor painting. Chapter 1495, The Lake. I have never heard of a river within the sacred spring mountain. Tegan muttered. According to what the outside world knew, the land of the collapsing mountain race was considered the sacred place for cultivation because it was the source of strength. The reason people had described the rare strength source as spring water was because there weren't much of them. It was commonly believed that here was a spring where the rare strength source was gushed out. This was why this mountain was called the Sacred Spring Mountain. Within the Sacred Spring Mountain, one could see a number of caves spreading out from the bottom part, like capillaries. You had to explore carefully to reach the bottom. Over the years, the collapsing mountain race had almost finished studying the inner structure of the Sacred Spring Mountain. Although the road here was complicated, there was still a map. But the map would not be given to anyone apart from the elders of the collapsing mountain race, even if they were members of the race who had participated in the coming-of-age ceremony. Chapman had wanted to hand over a portion of the map to Zen. The map had several locations marked where Zen could find more strength source. But the elders of the race rejected this plan. If this map were to be leaked, it would be dangerous for the collapsing mountain race. The power that Zen could obtain would still depend on his own ability. The collapsing mountain race obviously knew a lot about the Sacred Spring Mountain. But they didn't know everything about it. They only knew that there was a spring under the ground and that all the mountain's strength source must have come from it. The strength source had interesting characteristics. It looked like flowing water, which would flow down to the bottom of the mountain. But there were many times when the strength source would flip back, completely ignoring gravity, and climb to the top. The strength source, that should have been deep underground, would even appear at the top of the Sacred Spring Mountain and occasionally, even spill over the top of the mountain. In truth, the chaotic power around the collapsing mountain race was closely related to the strength source. Before today, no one had known that there was a river inside the Sacred Spring Mountain. If this news were to spread, the Sacred Spring Mountain might start to be called the Sacred River Mountain. Even Zen was excited at this. The barbarian bee queen had chased him, and with the bee queen's help, he had carved a new path for himself. The two of them stared blankly at the seven-colored river in front of them. It took them a few minutes to finally calm down. There was, however, a big problem. Zen had discovered quite a few strength sources along the way, but had managed to obtain only one drop in the end. He could see, but couldn't touch anything else. There was such a lot of strength source in this seven-colored river. But the strength source was still suspended at a high altitude. From the looks of it, they were at least 2,000 or 3,000 feet away. If they couldn't fly, they definitely wouldn't be able to climb up. Tegan was a little more clear-headed than Zen at the moment. He could not obtain the strength source above his head, but there was too much strength source around them. He walked quietly to the side and began to absorb the strength source in the crevices. Tegan had just swallowed a few drops when he spotted Zen gazing at him. He laughed awkwardly and said, "There are still quite a lot here. Let's split them, shall we?" The strength source in the crevices was in great amount. If one devoured enough of it, it would benefit them a lot. Many warriors who entered the mountain would only be able to obtain a few dozen drops of the strength source. Those with bad luck could only obtain a few drops, or even return empty-handed. Zen knew that there was a lot of strength source in the crevices, but since he was here and had seen the river, another faint thought ran through his mind. What he needed to devour wasn't just these few hundred drops of strength source. His goal on this trip to the sacred spring mountain was to obtain this river of strength source. But his strength would still increase a little if he swallowed only a drop of the strength source. Zen wouldn't mind devouring all of strength source here. And so, just like Tegan, Zen began to go around collecting the strength source from the cracks in the stone. The strength source was hanging upside down in the cracks of the rock. Zen reached out, took out each drop and put it into his mouth, as if he was swallowing dew. The pure strength source seemed to merge instantly with Zen's body, multiplying his strength at an enviable speed. Zen and Tegan walked along two sides of the cave as they went through the cracks in the rock to collect the strength source. Combined, these cracks were about 2 to 3 miles long, and they both devoured the strength source scattered within them, not leaving a single drop behind. As they moved forward, the stone walls on either side became smoother. There was no way to hide the strength source within them. Tegan's body stretched, the bones within intertwining and crackling like firecrackers, a sign of the power surging through his body. The mortal body could only bear so much strength source. Absorbing too much strength source was not necessarily a good thing. And Tegan's physical body was about to reach its limit now that it had consumed so many drops of strength source. Zen's body stretched a little, too, but he wasn't having such an extreme reaction. His strength might have been similar to Tegan's, a little weaker even. But the toughness of his body wasn't something that Tegan could compare with. "Are we still going forward?" Tegan asked. He was lucky to have followed Zen, and the prophets this time had far exceeded his expectations. "We still have a way back?" Zen asked. Tegan was stunned for a moment as he brought his large hand to his forehead. All the happiness he had felt from the growth of his strength had completely vanished. If they wanted to go back, they would have to climb back through the hole they fell into. But they didn't have the ability to climb back up, and also, the barbarian bee queen was still guarding the hole. It wouldn't turn out well for them if they went back. "What should we do?" Tegan asked. Zen said a little hesitantly, "We can only go forward." Zen guessed that they were in a bit of a pickle. They had opened a cave and discovered a brand new road that had never been explored before. There were many caves in the sacred spring mountain, all connected to each other. But after all these years, this river with the strength source hadn't been found by anyone, which meant only one thing: this cave was not connected to any other caves. The only connection to another cave was the hole that the barbarian bee queen had created. Zen couldn't think of anything else to do. So he did the only thing he could think of and kept walking forward. The river that flowed above them followed this flat road and became wider and wider. The river's edges were irregular at the start and had probably been formed naturally. But something seemed off as they walked. The edges of the river above them came to form a straight line, like a man-made canal. Nature had gone all out on this, but it was impossible for such a river to have been formed by nature. It was rather obvious that it was created by intelligent beings. Along with the river above them that seemed to be laid out regularly, the path under Zen's feet also became more regular, almost identical in shape to the river above them. The silver walls on both sides of the mountain became smoother and smoother. The intelligent beings that dug this river knew that the strength source would be reversed. So they dug out 2 canals at the same time, one at the top of the cave and one at the bottom. "I wonder what the purpose of this is," Zen said as he walked. Not long after, the space before them opened up. A huge circular pit appeared beneath their feet, and the 7-colored river above their heads fell into a waterfall. Ordinary waterfalls flowed straight down from top. But the waterfall above them flew straight up. It was the complete opposite. This was exactly what Zen had expected. He had seen complete reversal several times. But the waterfall flowed straight up and gathered in a circular lake at the top of the cave. An identical circular lake appeared naturally in front of Zen and Tegan. But the lake below them was empty. After all, only after the strength source had reversed itself would the lake's strength source fall into the lake below. Zen and Tegan stood beside the lake and looked around. Before long, they noticed something gray and blurry, jumping about in the middle of the lake. They could not see what exactly it was. But everything that appeared in this place was too bizarre, and neither Zen nor Tegan had any intention of entering the lake. They were curious about it, but their lives were more important. Chapter 1496, Reversal. Soon, the surrounding scenery transformed rapidly. Earlier, the journey route comprised of natural primitive caves. But later on, the landscape changed, revealing a lake and a flat mountain wall. The structures seemed to be man-made. There was also a gray dusky, unidentifiable object circling endlessly in the empty lake below. Zen and Tegan, staying close to the boundary, swiftly moved ahead. Since there was no other way, they decided to see what existed at the end of the path. The man-made lake was only about 3 miles long. At the end of the lake, there was a long and narrow passage. When they reached the end of the lake, they discovered that the bottom of the passage was an endless pit. Zen and Tegan looked at each other, clueless about the next step. Then Tegan took out a wooden stick from his coat and waved it in the air. And the end of the stick suddenly burst into flames. Tegan threw the flaming stick down into the pit. The two of them saw the flames increasingly become smaller for a long time before disappearing deep inside the pit. Tegan despairingly said, "What do we do now? We cannot even make out its end." When they fell from above and reached the artificial lake, they were already deep in the depths of the sacred spring mountain. They had absolutely no clue as to where they would reach, if they went inside this pit. They were not even sure if they would make out alive with the strong attraction force. "It seems like this place is also a dead end. There is no other way out now," Tegan said anxiously. He was afraid of being trapped to death and now that was definitely happening. "There's a way," Zen said suddenly. "What? Where is it?" Tegan hurriedly asked. Zen raised his hand and pointed upwards. The passageway in front of them had formed into a vault, above which there was another passageway, embedded on the ceiling. This way. Tegan soon discovered that the passage beneath their feet was connected to the passage above their head. The problem was that they were unable to pass through it. If only they could fly, they wouldn't have to go through all these problems. Zen's eyes narrowed as he turned around and looked at the lake behind him. After Zen entered the sacred spring mountain, he discovered that the strength source reversed and flowed in the opposite direction. The reverse system seemed to be carried across the strength source. If that was the case, then there had to be some sort of mechanism within the sacred spring mountain that controlled the reverse system. For the time being, seeing the passageway hang from the ceiling lifted Zen's spirit. The secret path in front of them was definitely designed to allow people to pass through. The gravitational force there was so great that even a great martial artist could not fly in the air, but rely on the reversal gravitational force to pass through. So this mechanism had to be somewhere around here. There was nothing else in the artificial lake apart from the dusky object. Was this the key to the reversal of gravitational force? Tegan leaned against the wall. He was impatient because he obtained a lot of strength source during this trip. In this case, being ranked first in this coming-of-age ceremony would be very easy. The key was to survive, otherwise this whole expedition would prove useless. He faintly smiled when he saw Zen deep in thought to find a way out. Zen had a very determined mindset, who never seemed to be discouraged by any kind of challenges. "It's useless. The terrain here is not that tough, and we didn't see any forks along the way. We will have to jump down. If there's no other way, then let's jump down and try our luck." Even though Tegan uttered these words, he knew clearly that if he jumped into that bottomless abyss, there might not be any way out. They would be trapped in forever. Zen didn't respond to Tegan's words and instead walked towards the artificial lake. "What are you doing?" Tegan exclaimed. At the center of this artificial lake revolved that hazy thing. He couldn't understand what it was, since nobody at the collapsing mountain race had mentioned it. Probably even the prophet didn't know what it was. Moreover, the strength source of this sacred spring mountain had fed quite a few terrifying creatures. An advice for the collapsing mountain members when they entered the mountain would be not to provoke any of these strange beasts. "You will surely die if you go down." Even though he said this, Tegan followed Zen's suit. He did not want to be left behind. At least Zen would be around to face the challenges ahead. Zen ignored Tegan's words and moved ahead. Zen believed in finding the best opportunity to find a path. Even if the path was risky, he would face it. That was Zen's way of doing things. Puff. Zen closed his eyes for a moment and jumped into the artificial lake. Since the lake was not very deep, he could walk towards the gray object. As he got closer, he could make out the object clearly. Zen soon realized that the circling object was in fact just a lot of thin smoke. As it kept drifting continuously, it gave an illusion of a circular object. Suddenly, in the middle of the smoke, Zen could make out an 8-diagram ball. By now, Tegan had also jumped into the lake and was wading towards Zen. He just could not stand helplessly by the shore. Tegan was relieved to see that the object did not attack Zen as he got closer. He feverishly hoped that the object was their key to escape. Tegan just couldn't think of any other way through which they could leave this place. Zen cautiously stepped towards the 8-diagram ball. He was very careful of the movements he made. He had to be careful and was on the lookout for any kind of traps placed around the ball. If he got trapped, then there would be limited chances to fight back. 100 feet, 50 feet, 30 feet, 10 feet, and finally, Zen walked into the gray mist. Before he entered, Zen held his breath. He did not trust the nature of the smoke. What if it was laden with some sort of poison? Okay, this feels safe. I can move forward. Zen felt more optimistic. Perhaps his guess was right, and the object should be related to the reversal of attraction force. Zen grasped the 8-diagram ball and snatched it away from its place. The ball felt very cool in his hands and was smooth and heavy. Zen held the 8-diagram ball in one hand and examined it carefully. There were 2 colored holes on it, black and white. Cracks were formed along the lines of the 8-diagram pattern in the center of the sphere. After turning the ball many times in his hand and carefully scrutinizing it, he still remained clueless about the ball's mystery. He tried to use his blood to make the ball recognize him as its master, and then used his own mental power to immerse himself in the 8-diagram ball, but the ball remained still. After trying these methods, he grabbed the top and twisted it to the right. Click! With that sound, the black and white holes flipped down and the ball opened. Just at this moment, there was a rumble, and Zen saw the strength source of the lake above his head directly toppling down towards him. At that moment, Tegan also reached the dusky mist and was about to warn Zen not to touch the object. If Zen wasn't careful enough and triggered some mechanism, they would die there. But before he could say anything, Zen had already opened it. Splash! If a bowl of water was poured, it would cause ripple and commotion. Imagine what the entire strength source of the lake could create. After the attraction force was reversed, the strength source descended from the artificial lake above their heads to the artificial lake below, immediately dousing Zen and Tegan. Tegan was speechless at this sight. So this was it. This was the whole strength source of the lake. Was it really that easy to get it? The strength source kept pouring continuously in the artificial lake below. After a long time, Zen and Tegan finally floated up from the bottom of the lake. I will absorb all the strength source now. Ha ha. Tegan was ecstatic after seeing this. By absorbing a small amount of the strength source, he might become the future leader of the collapsing mountain race. Imagine his powers if he could absorb the entire strength source. Earlier, Tegan had doubts about becoming powerful, but now he could brush those thoughts aside. But at the same time, he knew that he could absorb only a limited portion of the strength source. Although Tegan was physically stronger than the warriors of other races, there was still a limit. If he absorbed the entire strength source, his physical body would soon reach its saturation point. In the meantime, Zen was quietly floating on the lake, advancing ahead. His thirst for strength was many times greater than that of Tegan. His capacity to absorb the maximum amount of strength was also higher. Soon, he was completely focused on devouring the entire strength source. Chapter 1497, A Miniature Divine Land. When compared to a warrior of the same level as he, Zen's physical body was obviously much stronger than most. In terms of his body's capacity though, he sometimes found himself facing certain limitations. Now was one of those times. The numerous strength source surrounding Zen was constantly and continuously absorbed by his body. The strength filled him in the deepest places of his inner self, including his bones, muscles, organs, and spine. This form of strength absorption created an ultimate increase of power within Zen. It was as though his body and mind were always alert and crystal clear. He felt inexhaustible, invincible, and most of all, Zen felt abundant. At the moment though, the strength source to be absorbed was far greater in amount than Zen had ever faced before. His body worked hard, the numerous strength filling him more and more. It didn't take too long before the feeling of wonderful abundance began to transform into the harsh sensation of being full. And he recognized the feeling of fullness. He knew what it meant, too. It meant his capacity of absorption had nearly reached its limit, and yet, so much strength source remained. This sensation had overcome him once before, when he had borrowed the dragon scale's power. With so much strength to be contained within one single person, Zen's body couldn't bear the load. He had stopped just in time back then. Zen equally knew that if he forcibly absorbed the strength source, his body wouldn't hold and would easily disintegrate. Of course, this was something he had to avoid at all costs. But what to do now? Staring out at the strength source before him, Zen realized he had absorbed less than a 10,000th of it all. He was drenched with a stressed sweat and felt overwhelmingly discouraged. His feeling was comparable to a person leaving a treasure mountain empty-handed. The problem was, there were simply too many treasures to choose from. The strength source here can help you break through the 8-path platforms. This is a one-of-a-kind opportunity, so make the most of it. A faint voice spoke from the depths of Zen's mind. Was this the Cyan dragon reaching out to him? It had to be. After the 9 genuine dragons had been awakened, they had since maintained their silence in his mind. So much so that even when he tried reaching out or speaking to them, they wouldn't respond. This was different though. Zen knew with certitude that the cyan dragon had spoken. They really don't want me to waste this opportunity, Zen thought to himself. Zen hadn't been refining his body for very long, nor had he gotten very far. At the time, he had only managed to forge one path platform. And he had had the help of the cloud-chasing lion's bone, at that. Now the cyan dragon had spoken his word which had wiped Zen free of any doubts or insecurities. This time, he didn't hesitate. Sure, it was true that these 9 genuine dragons had other intentions, of which he had been warned. Zen still chose to believe them, though. He knew this was important. Now that the power had pierced directly through the center of his eyebrows and had hit his mind, a torrent of strength source washed over him. The power was so strong and unexpected that it instantly destroyed the path platform forged with the cloud-chasing lion's bone. Whoa, what the heck, what's going on? Momentarily stunned, Zen let out a deep breath and regained his composure. He had definitely not been expecting something so intense. While he floated, a bold and crystal-clear smile was transmitted from the depths of his mind. Now, it was the red dragon's voice he heard. Our big brother has taken a stand, the voice boomed. Thus, I shall act as an obedient little brother. It now became obvious to Zen that what was happening here was definitely an extraordinary opportunity. This wouldn't happen twice, that he was also sure of it. If he missed out on it, then he might never get his chance again. Zen's eyes caught something moving just above his level of sight. He lifted his eyes only slightly and saw the complex pattern of steam emanating from his forehead. Now that the red dragon had spoken his word, Zen was now empowered with a spiritual force. Now, young man, you must follow the steam and guide the strength source. Strength, that is extremely pure and without fault. In its natural form, it is countless times better than the cloud-chasing lion's bone. Trust me, a path platform forged from this strength source is nothing the cloud-chasing lion could ever compare to. Do as I say. Without a moment's hesitation, Zen closed his eyes and immediately obeyed what the red dragon had told him to do. Putting all his concentration toward the strength flow, vortexes soon began to appear. They formed in Zen's hands, his legs, head, chest, back and even his cinnabar field. What was happening now? Frantically, and thankfully for Zen, the vortexes that he had just formed began to absorb the strength source, as if doing it for him. Zen felt a sudden and enormous sense of relief. On his own, before the dragons had reached out to him, Zen had easily absorbed over 10,000 drops of the strength source. Now though, the 8 vortexes he created were each capable of absorbing just as much if not more than his own body could. He watched them, completely amazed at how powerful he had become. Despite the astonishing work the vortexes created, there was too much strength source surrounded Zen, and too much energy remained. A lake as large as this one simply had too many absorbable drops of strength source. Zen took the time to assess the situation. Currently, he felt perfectly fine. Having absorbed 100,000 drops of strength source himself now had virtually no consequence. And yet before, he had felt so full. Zen brought his focus and strength back to absorbing the strength source. Path platforms, sparkling and enticing with a dazzling shine, appeared at the opening of the 8 vortexes. The 8 path platforms of Body Refiner often twisted off and formed different shapes, but most of them were milky white path platforms. This was because most body refiners would form their own path platforms based on the rare white bones. However, Zen's path platforms were 7-colored. This strength source was so enormous, so great, it was indescribable. Assuredly, no such strength source could exist within the universe. If something of the kind did exist, then it was no doubt much, much smaller in size. And of course, there wouldn't be half as many drops of strength source to be absorbed. It would be completely impossible for an ordinary warrior to find such a large amount of strength source. Even if Laquisha's brother got really lucky or had great karma going for him, there was no way he would ever find such an amazing amount of strength source. In other words, her brother couldn't even compare himself with Zen's gaining. Straightly put, Zen had to spend every drop of strength source he could muster in order to build his 8-path platforms and form his most solid foundation. Zen was very aware that this kind of treatment was special. Unique, in a way. And it was also notably quite rare in the Divine Land. In any case, it was only the Holy Being's disciples that were actually capable of extracting strength source like this. Holy Beings used this absorbed strength source to build the universes. Undoubtedly, this strength source was more than just precious in the eyes of the Holy Beings. They needed this strength in order to continue building, and taking the decision to have it absorbed was difficult for them due to the constant extraction of their power. As for the master of divine refinement Forbidden Land, why he was so willing to have all his personal strength source extracted. That was and would remain a mystery. The master shared his strength source with the living creatures around him. By the time all the path platforms were completed, each of them flashing dazzling ray of light, a solid 5 minutes had passed. For Zen though, it was like having traveled entire lifetimes of numerous body refiners. Not only that, but his path platforms were the purest ones around and they were already in their most perfect stage, without any cracks or flaws. Finally, his 8 path platforms were completed. Slowly, the vortexes that had earlier been created within all parts of Zen's body began to gradually dissipate into thin air. The absorption of the strength source equally slowed before coming to a complete stop. The 8 path platforms have been formed. Now, you can prepare for the 9 divine stars. Making him jump slightly in surprise, the red dragon's voice sounded once again in his mind. Zen kept his eyes firmly closed. Following the patterns the red dragon had sent him, Zen continued to absorb the strength source. There wasn't much left, thanks to the vortexes, and now with the red dragon's encouragement, Zen felt capable of finishing the job. Quickly after the strength source was absorbed, it began circulating within Zen's cinnabar field. For a body refiner, having the 9 divine stars was a one-way path to perfection. And Zen, as a body refiner, knew he had to attain this goal more than anything else he had ever achieved in the past. Working within his own inner world, he had to create those 9 stars of utmost importance and greatness. It must be said that a normal warrior would never create stars in their inner world. It was simple, a warrior wasn't a holy being. Their inner world was therefore incomplete. Body refiners, on the other hand, had 9 stars in their cinnabar field. With the 9 stars forming a circle, their power could and would grow endlessly. The challenge here was building them. Isn't it too early for Zen to build the 9 divine stars? Asked a green-colored genuine dragon. Since the ancient times, since the beginning of their history, cultivation had always been a specialty. One could say that such was even favored. Whether it was the lower world, the upper world, or even the divine land, cultivators who could cultivate both body and life vitality simultaneously were beings of an extreme rarity. And such beings had to be cared for. Members with this level of power had to live in order to achieve greatness. These cultivators who could cultivate both body and life vitality at the same time definitely couldn't go further on this path. But this limit was only for ordinary warriors. In fact, if a true god of the divine land had the desire to pursue the path of holy being, they wouldn't just cultivate these 2, but cultivate 3. They were soul, life vitality and body. And it was only when one reached the genuine pinnacle of soul cultivation, life vitality cultivation and body refining, would they have the qualifications to build a true inner world. Only then would they have the qualifications to construct such a universe, a world of its own, placed at the edge of the divine land. Right now, Zen was only a warrior of the Spirit Supreme Realm. It was a known fact that the inner world of a warrior of the Spirit Supreme Realm was incapable of holding 9 stars. The green genuine dragon was right. It was too early for Zen. The moment the strength source would enter his inner world, it would explode Zen's weak inner world. Needless to say, such a result would be extremely tragic. The green dragon continued mulling over his thoughts. Of course, his greatest worry right now was that Zen's current inner world would explode, especially in its actual state. No, Zen's inner world is indeed weak, but it's no longer an ordinary inner world. He now has a real inner world. The 5-clawed golden dragon opened his mouth to speak. They could see Zen's every move and they all had been watching him with intent and interest. All the dragons had kept their eyes on him, never daring to look away, not even for a second, not even to blink. They had watched him remove a small but lively fish from his own inner world. Facial expressions began to change while they watched this scene, going from outright astonished to overwhelmed with emotion. What the genuine dragons had been observing all along was becoming clear to them all. The images playing before their eyes allowed them to finally understand what they were dealing with. Zen's inner world did have the same characteristics as that of a holy being. His inner world was constructed from chaotic energy, which was beyond the comprehension of the genuine dragons. In a way, Zen was a small, holy being. In fact, he could even be stronger than one. The inner world created by the holy being was formed from life vitality, and was limited by the heavens. If any living creature within it wanted to transcend this boundary, they would have to comprehend the godly way in order to obtain the qualifications for crossing the heavens and entering the divine land. As for Zen's inner world, it was on a whole new level. It was instead formed from chaotic energy and without restriction from the heavens, all living creatures could leave his inner world directly. Looking at it from this angle, Zen's inner world was most definitely not just any ordinary world. It was far from an ordinary universe, even. This was a divine land. A miniature divine land. Yes, the 9 genuine dragons had chosen Zen for their own purpose. They wished to return to their own land, to guide Zen in his search for the truth, and they wished that he would ultimately help them seek revenge. Which gave reason as to why the grand weapon refining method had been used on Zen, resulting in his unique body and capacity. As soon as Zen entered the fairy palace and started practicing the primal chaos technique, the situation had already begun to take a turn for the better. Zen's cultivation had begun progressing beyond any dragon's wildest expectations. Chapter 1498. 9 Divine Stars. Zen had mastered the primal chaos technique with his weapon-like body, and at the time, the inner world had undergone a fundamental change. If the grand weapon refining method allowed Zen to embark on a completely different path of body refinement, then the primal chaos technique would allow him to embark on a completely different path of life vitality cultivation. The genuine dragons weren't sure if the inner world built on the foundation of chaos could really evolve into another divine land. They weren't even sure just how far Zen could go on this path. But they knew that if he continued on this path, Zen would reach heights that they couldn't even imagine. The strength source went down from Zen's chest all the way to his cinnabar field and then into his inner world. Zen's inner world had grown larger and larger, and the species that were born within it had become more and more abundant. An ape made its way through the bushes, feeding on sweet berries. This ape had already evolved into a bit of intelligence, and knew how to avoid some of the land's ferocious beasts and poisonous bugs. It was interested in getting to the end of the land, where the massive tree was. There seemed to be something special about that tree, something that exuded a great attractive force. But despite its strength, it still was unable to climb such a tall world tree. The ape had harvested an impressive amount today. Once it had plucked quite a few berries, it decided to return to its cave. There were still some little apes there, crying out in joy. An explosion shook the ground, causing the ape to tremble in fear. It finally raised its head and looked up at the sky for the first time. The deep sky attracted the ape's attention. This was the first time that any living being within Zen's inner world had consciously looked up at the sky. Just what kind of place was in the depths of the sky? What was that place outside the sky? The ape already knew how to think. But the concept of sky did not exist in its mind. It was just instinctively curious and thinking. The explosion had barely died down when a colorful line appeared in the sky. This line looked like a rainbow snake on the ground and frightened the ape. The snake circled in the air, as if it wanted to split the sky open. It wasn't long before the snake began to curl up into a ball, looking like some kind of unknown round fruit. The strength source was a fatal attraction for all living beings, even for those within Zen's inner world. The fruit looked so tasty, the ape couldn't help but stretch out its hands towards the round ball in the sky. But it was too far away. A second round ball appeared not long after the first one had. And then the third, followed by a fourth and a fifth. The ape stretched out both its hands and folded one finger. 9 fingers meant there were 9 balls in the sky. It had already known how to count. Suddenly, the strange howls of fierce beasts rang through. The ape stopped looking at the sky. On this continent, although the ape was intelligent, it was no match for the ferocious beasts. It had to become smarter if it wanted to fight the ferocious beasts. It carried its harvest of berries as it followed a hidden path back to its cave. All living creatures on this piece of land were looking up at the sky. But creatures other than the ape found the most instinctual restlessness and the attraction from the strength source in the sky. They neither had the basic intelligence, nor did they know how to think. Vast amount of strength source gathered in the sky. The stars would now be constructed according to the red dragon's method. The inner world of a warrior contained all the elements of life, but no stars. Even the inner world of a true god didn't have any stars. Even if the true gods who cultivated both body and life vitality in the divine land built 9 divine stars and had mature inner worlds, they still couldn't gather the 9 divine stars into their inner worlds. If any true god were to achieve this, he or she wouldn't be very far from becoming a holy being. As the 9 stars continued to condense, they started to emit a bright rainbow-colored light, illuminating Zen's inner world as he continuously absorbed the strength source. Tegan had only absorbed a few thousand drops of strength source, yet he was already close to saturation. And right now, he could only watch as Zen absorbed it. Tegan looked on in fascination, not having imagined the scene before in his wildest dreams. Zen had been lying in this lake of strength source for a long time. Tegan felt that the amount of strength source Zen could absorb shouldn't be so much more than what he could absorb. Absorbing tens of thousands of drops were sufficient for Zen and wouldn't take more than 30 seconds. About an hour later, Zen was still lying with his eyes closed. Aren't you being too greedy? There's no need to force it if you can't absorb it. He was actually upset since he was able to absorb just a tiny bit of the strength source despite seeing so much. Tegan understood Zen's thoughts very well. But their cultivation was limited and there was a limit to the amount of strength source they could bear. Even if Chapman were to personally come down here, it would be impossible for him to completely absorb a lake of strength source. It would be great if he could absorb even 1,000th of the strength source. But things were not over yet. All of a sudden, he saw 8 small vortexes appearing on Zen's body. He saw the strength source continuously enter Zen's body through the vortexes. 8 path platforms. The refining technique that the collapsing mountain race employed was primitive. They did not know how to create path platforms. Constructing 8 path platforms and forging 9 divine stars were perfect ways of body refinement. The collapsing mountain race did not adopt these ways, which was why they had never created path platforms or built 9 divine stars. The collapsing mountain race was a unique one. Although their body refinement method was primitive, it wasn't exactly bad. It was just that Tegan felt a little faint as he watched this scene. After all, the strength source that Zen absorbed was probably much greater than what he absorbed, twice as great, even. Zen finally stopped absorbing the strength source a while later, but he still lay in the lake with his eyes closed. Still unwilling to come up? Tegan asked, his eyes wide. He really didn't believe that Zen could absorb any more. But just as this thought crossed his mind, the lake formed from the strength source began to suddenly ripple. A huge whirlpool formed, with Zen at the center of it. One could only imagine the ferocity of Zen's absorption of the strength source, given this turbulence. At this rate of absorption, drop could no longer be used to measure it. How is this possible? Even if the entire collapsing mountain race jumped into the lake and began to frantically absorb the strength source, they still wouldn't be able to achieve such a result. How much strength source could this guy hold? Would he completely absorb all of it? It couldn't be. This terrifying thought suddenly occurred to Tegan. The collapsing mountain race relied on their strength source. If Zen were to completely absorb the strength source, things would not look good. Zen was at the center of this whirlpool as it churned. He continuously infused the strength source into his inner world and condensed it into the 9 stars. The light of the 9 stars became brighter and brighter, illuminating Zen's inner world, to the point where it became hard to distinguish between these 7 colors. They began to turn into a blinding light, the color of the sun. Zen's body had produced 7 suns. When the process of creating the 9 divine stars had reached a certain degree, Zen's inner world began to tremble, and the chaotic sea began to surge. The 7 suns emitted a massive gravitational force that triggered the tide in the chaotic sea. Zen had stopped absorbing because even if his inner world was special, there was still a limit to the strength source he could bear. If he were to continue absorbing it, the gravitational force from the strength source could cause a mess within his inner world, and could even tear it apart. Chapter 1499, Changing Gravity. You finally stopped. Tegan from the collapsing mountain race stared at Zen in awe. He couldn't understand how Zen was able to absorb so many drops of strength source. A quarter of the strength source in the huge lake had been absorbed by Zen. After he stopped his absorption, Zen finally opened his eyes. A shadow of a smile played on his lips as he swam towards the shore from the middle of the lake. How did you absorb so much strength source? Tegan asked, awestruck. Zen winked as he said, I drank it. Nonsense, Tegan whispered. He thought about how Zen could have drank it. When Zen reversed the strength source in the lake, the strength source in the countless caves within the sacred spring mountain also reversed, as well as the strength source that was originally unreachable. The strength source's features were already known to the collapsing mountain race, as they had protected the strength source for countless years and thus had already performed extensive research on it. The collapsing mountain race considered the strength source as animate, which meant that after a period of time, it would be reversed. The strength source that was originally pooled on the floor would flow up to the ceiling as soon as people entered the sacred spring mountain. The strength source would continue to meander along the ceiling. Due to the nature of the strength source, most martial artists who entered the sacred spring mountain were only able to obtain a very small amount of strength source. This reversal often occurred after a martial artist had entered the mountain. There were only a handful of martial artists that managed to capture a portion of the strength source before the backflow. However, due to a lucky accident, Zen had explored an undiscovered path and found the key item to control the flow of the strength source. It was the 8 diagram ball which he held in his hand. At that moment, in every corner of the sacred spring mountain, the vast majority of martial artists were ecstatic. In a long and narrow cave, the strength source formed a stream that lazily flowed above. 3 martial artists traveled together, but all they were able to do was staring at the strength source flowing above their heads, unreachable. They focused their attention more on the stone walls around the cave, as they hoped to find a few drops of strength source embedded within. Right then, the gravity of the strength source suddenly reversed. The strength source at the ceiling of the cave began to fall down like a rain shower, and caused the 3 martial artists to rejoice. Scenes like this were common all across the entire sacred spring mountain. Other than Zen and Tegan, no one had a clue why this happened. This year was destined to be a fruitful one for the collapsing mountain race. Zen took the 8-diagram ball with him when they left the lake. He looked at the remaining half of the lake filled with the strength source, feeling a little hesitant to leave. As of the moment, his inner world and body had already reached their limits, so he was unable to store any more strength source. However, he thought of the considerable amount of strength source that he would need in the future. Zen immediately stopped himself thinking about it. It was already a great opportunity when he obtained such a lucky chance to increase his own strength. If the strength source was truly the power of a holy being, it would be too greedy on Zen's part to take it all away. There are times when one should know when to stop. Excessive greed often has devastating repercussions. This divine refinement forbidden land emanated such a strange aura everywhere. The holy being that built this divine refinement forbidden land was very generous in allowing all living beings to partake of his strength source, and that was not logical. But, how do we leave? Tegan asked, as he returned to the original question. He looked around at their surroundings. Zen ignored Tegan's words, and observed the 8-diagram ball in his hand. A while ago, he had twisted the white part down and caused the strength source to pour down. He now grabbed the black part and twisted it towards another direction. Crack! As soon as the 8-diagram ball was activated, Zen immediately felt the gravity inside the sacred spring mountain reverse once again. To their surprise, what was reversed was not the strength source, but all the living beings in the sacred spring mountain. Dang it, Tegan cursed. He felt the earth and sky spin, and his entire body fell directly towards the ceiling. Before he fell, he had suddenly twisted his body so he fell horizontally onto the ceiling. At least, he did not let his head hit the ceiling directly. Zen seemed to have been prepared for what happened. He twisted his body in the air, and stood on the ceiling. The 2 of them looked like bats that stood upside down on the ceiling. But to themselves, they were standing on the ceiling because their own gravitational direction had been changed. Both of them were still doing well. Simultaneously, all the warriors in the entire sacred spring mountain had been reversed. There were also many powerful creatures living inside the caves that had turned around and hung on the ceiling of each cave. What happened? The gravitational force here suddenly flipped. Dang, I almost fell to my death. It was Zen's favor to these warriors that they obtained a great number of the strength source. However, they also suffered a great loss because of Zen now. Now you know how to leave, right? Zen told Tegan with a smile. Since the 8-diagram ball changed the gravity and the narrow passageway was constructed in such a strange manner, Zen had already made some assumptions. The only way he could be able to go through that passageway was if he changed his own gravity. Get ready. Zen twisted the 8-diagram ball in his hand once again as he finished speaking, which caused him and Tegan to fall from the ceiling. This time, Zen still landed safely on the ground. Tegan, on the contrary, once again tragically smashed down to the floor, as he had not expected Zen's sudden action. He was thankful for his strong body, otherwise, falling down from such a high altitude under such a powerful gravitational force would hurt him significantly. Can you not move so suddenly? Tegan said angrily from behind Zen. I've warned you, answered Zen as he walked forward with the 8-diagram ball. Under Zen's lead, the 2 of them rapidly arrived at the long and narrow passageway. The world beyond the end of the passageway was in absolute darkness, with the exception of the path that hung above their heads. Ready. As soon as Zen's words were spoken, Tegan's entire body tensed up as if he was about to face a powerful enemy. Seeing Tegan's expression, Zen smiled a bit. No need to be so nervous. I know this place is dangerous. I'll be careful. Tegan had already experienced it before. This place was too deep to see the bottom, so he wasn't sure where he would fall to. When both of them were as close to the edge of the passageway as possible, Zen twisted the 8-diagram ball in his hand again. Crack! Gravity reversed. Zen and Tegan took a step forward simultaneously. They didn't fall down to nowhere, but landed on the narrow passageway above. This time, both of them landed safely. They walked forward upside down on the passageway. They walked along this path for 2 miles. The end of this passageway once again formed a fault. However, another passageway appeared below the two of them. Come on. Zen switched the gravitational force again, and the two of them fell down from the passageway above into the one below. This was a very strange path. They needed to rely on this 8-diagram ball to constantly change the direction of gravity, sometimes downwards, sometimes upwards. When they got used to the changing gravity, they eventually relaxed. The tragic predicament of the other warriors inside the sacred spring mountain was another matter. They had just started getting used to the reversed gravity when it suddenly changed. They struck against the ceiling of the cave, and when the gravity shifted once again, they smashed down ferociously. They were completely confused by the constantly changing gravity. Had the sacred spring mountain gone crazy? All sorts of curses were heard throughout. However, none of them were able to change the direction of the gravitational force. They could only try their best to endure it. There were some martial artists that figured out a way to avoid being tossed about so willy-nilly. After falling down twice and realizing that the situation would repeat itself, they held tightly on stone pillars or stuck themselves in cracks. Eventually, after Zen and Tegan had walked on the passageways above and below, they finally reached the end. A stone door appeared in front of the two warriors. Chapter 1500. Gigantic Badger. According to Tegan, although the paths of the sacred spring mountain were quite complicated, they would still lead to the main road at the bottom of the mountain. One could follow the main road from the bottom of the mountain to the top and find their way back to the collapsing mountain race. If this was true, then the path that Zen had taken should lead them to the main road. From his calculations, they should be at the bottom of the sacred spring mountain by now. However, it seemed that they were led to a dead end. Instead of the main road, the two discovered a cave in a sealed-off area, a place that no one had entered before. Looking around, Zen realized that the door in front of him was the only way out. Would he be able to leave this place? The situation was starting to get frustrating. But Zen had already made up his mind. If this place turned out to be a dead end, he would turn back to where he came from and start again. The most challenging and difficult part of the sacred spring mountain was the solid silver rock. Its surface was extremely smooth, not even a curb or a lump that one could hold onto, thus making it hard to climb. In this situation, all the strength source that Zen had absorbed could be put to good use. Now that his power had increased drastically, it had changed the course of the situation. Standing at the front of the stone door, Tegan was the first to try his luck. He placed his hands against the stone door, took a deep breath, and pushed it. Ha ha! Tegan put all his energy into his arms and hands, and as a great force flowed into his body, his veins and muscles suddenly bulged. The strength source had increased Tegan's strength exponentially, and he felt reborn. He pushed against the door with all his might, but the stone door did not even budge. Tegan knew that he had exhausted his strength to the limit, so when he saw that nothing had happened, he gave up and jokingly said, "I guess I'm not worthy." He looked around to find Zen. The latter had already absorbed so much strength source and was readying himself for his turn. There was no way he would surrender as Tegan did. A member of the collapsing mountain race would always be proud of his strength and would never depend on a man from another race. On Tegan's mark, Zen slowly approached the stone door with an indifferent expression in his eyes. Zen had achieved many breakthroughs. He refined his body with preternatural flames, absorbed the strength source, constructed 8 path platforms and forged 9 divine stars in collapsing mountain race. The power that he harnessed was quite different from the power he would usually borrow from a genuine dragon. It felt even more real. This hidden power from his body was so extreme that whenever he made a move, it would naturally explode from every part of his body. Another thing was, Zen could not yet use the full potential of the borrowed power. But the power that he had harnessed right now felt like water smoothly flowing out of his body. Zen now stood at the front of the door. He then slowly extended his hands and placed them on the stone door. "Open for me," Zen commanded. In an instant, an enormous force was released from his hands. The power suddenly spread out and blew like a strong wind. Swishy, swishy, swishy. Tegan felt strong pressure from the power that Zen had released. He tried to keep his ground but lost his balance and was pushed back. If he hadn't used his left foot to fight the pressure, he would have rolled to the ground several steps away from the door. The place was suddenly covered in dust, and Tegan had to shield his eyes. With the strength that Zen had exerted, Tegan was positive that the door would move. When the dust finally settled, Tegan immediately looked at the door. But to his surprise and dismay, the door had not moved even the slightest. The strength source that Zen's physical body harnessed was several times greater than Tegan's, but in the end, it still wasn't enough. 8-path platforms, Zen commanded, and the 8-path platforms on his body began to radiate brightly. The strength frantically spread out from the 8-path platforms, causing Zen's strength to increase by another fold. Zen already showcased an unimaginable power from mere body strength, and now that he used the 8-path platforms, that immense body strength had become more powerful. Rumble. A muffled rumble could be heard from the stone door in front of him as it revealed a small crack. Zen had finally pushed the door open. And there was hope. The rumbling sound of the door continued as Zen exerted the same force onto it. Then it went silent. Zen drew his arms back, looked at the door, and smirked. Alas, the door was finally open. It wasn't fully opened, but the crack was enough for the two of them to pass through. I knew you could do it. Awesome. A ray of hope shone from Tegan's eyes. It was a custom in the collapsing mountain race to revere Hercules. The ideology of this race was quite simple, they honored the strongest. Aside from the prophet, the collapsing mountain race also worshipped the most powerful and strongest being. Even outsiders would get a chance to lead this race if they proved themselves worthy. The world on the other side of the door was dark. But Zen didn't hesitate and went into that dark side through the door. Tegan followed suit. But the moment Zen stepped into the other side of the door, something unexpected suddenly happened. A bright light emitted from within the 8-diagram ball in his hand. Zen could sense bizarre aura coming from the ball. In an instant, the ball escaped from Zen's hand and rapidly flew outside the door towards the direction where the two came from. After flying a great distance, the ball fell into the lake of strength source and a loud splashing sound could be heard. As the 8-diagram ball continued to submerge, it began to rotate underwater. The force of its rotation created a whirlpool and the strength source in the lake shot up, then eventually landed into the lake on the ceiling. Zen was dumbfounded as it happened so fast that he didn't have time to react. He realized that someone was preventing him from taking the 8-diagram ball beyond the door. Fortunately, he hadn't stored the strength source in his space ring, otherwise, he couldn't imagine what could have happened. There must be an almighty elder watching over this place and whoever would step in this place. Beyond Zen's knowledge, the 8-diagram ball didn't just return to its original location, but the mountain was also completely repaired. Even the hole that the barbarian bee queen inflicted on it had vanished like it didn't happen at all. As soon as the ball exited, the stone door slowly began to close. Once again, Tegan and Zen were covered in complete darkness. Their eyes adjusted to the dark, but they still couldn't see anything. There was only one path on this other side of the door and each side was covered with silver rocks. They figured that it was the only path they could take. Without saying a word, Tegan and Zen had thought of the same thing. All the bizarre things in this place were orchestrated by a person and that person could be by their side right now. The two decided to move forward along the path in silence. But before they could even take a step, a blinding light suddenly flashed in front of them. They felt as if they had passed through a dark and narrow tunnel before finally entering an extremely wide cave. As their eyes adjusted to the light, they looked around and was surprised to see piles of silver rocks behind them. Zen and Tegan realized that they were already outside of the dark world. Someone had used some special method to send them out. Between the two of them, Zen was more stunned. He had mastered the space law and could easily detect it, but when the light flashed earlier, he didn't sense any fluctuations of the law power at all. It could only mean that the theurgy of the person who sent them out was beyond Zen's comprehension. Maybe it's the one who built the divine refinement forbidden land, Zen pondered to himself. There couldn't be anyone more interesting to Zen than the master of the divine refinement forbidden land. He badly wanted to understand the master's purpose of generously giving away strength source. The strength source of this master existed in 6 great cultivation places, but it followed nature's law of balance. If the life forms in the divine refinement forbidden land were to devour the energy, they would have to return it eventually. Even the powerful warriors in the universe who couldn't cross the heavens would have to return whatever was given to them to the universe. Dust would turn back into dust. Everything gained in this universe would eventually be returned to the universe. However, when a foreign warrior entered the divine refinement forbidden land and obtained the strength source, it was a real loss for the master. The master of the divine refinement forbidden land was quite generous. While Zen was lost in his thoughts, Tegan could not believe that they made it out of the dark space on the other side of the door. His face was filled with excitement. He beamed at Zen and said, "This is the road at the bottom of the sacred spring mountain, and it extends from the deepest part of the underground to the exit." But just as he finished, the smile on his face faded. Tegan suddenly pointed his finger towards the road ahead, then said, "But I'm afraid the exit is too deep and narrow." The road led directly to the exit of the sacred spring mountain, but the strength source here was extremely sparse. Most of the strength source was gathered towards the higher areas of the mountain up to its peak. It was a phenomenon that was hard to explain. But to simply put it, the sacred spring mountain had an inverted gravity that affected the strength source's flow. This was the reason why the strength source normally gathered towards the higher areas of the mountain. The densely packed caves in the middle of the road would lead to the peak of the mountain. However, Zen and Tegan were now on the other side of the road, which was at the bottom of the sacred spring mountain. This place housed plenty of powerful beasts, and their growth had something to do with the strength source. "Hey, those are gigantic badgers," Tegan commented. Common badgers were as small as regular kittens, but these monstrous badgers were the size of a raging bull. They were huge but agile. These monstrous badgers had a killing aura as they slowly approached the two. Tegan was not yet prepared to face this kind of creature. In the collapsing mountain race, only grown-up men could kill monstrous badgers. Zen nodded. Unlike Tegan, Zen was equipped with skills to defeat these monstrous badgers. He was just worried that there was not enough space to use all his strength. With a push at his feet, he rushed towards them. Zen and Tegan were easy prey for these monstrous badgers. They split up, intending to surround their prey so they wouldn't escape. But they didn't expect that Zen had no intention of escaping. Instead, he was the first to launch an attack at them. Roar! One of the badgers roared as a warning to the rest. 3 of the badgers quickly responded and they attacked towards Zen. These badgers had an unbelievable intelligence unlike any other creatures in the mountain. They could quickly react against an attack and knew how to work as a team to defeat their enemies. Their extraordinary strength and agility were their advantage over any creature. With these, they could easily triumph over any ordinary warriors. But their luck had seemingly run out, as this time, it was no ordinary warrior. They had finally met Zen.